Okay, welcome to Unit 7 and a brand spanking new time period, 1900 to the present-ish. And in order to set the stage for all the world wars and depressions and decolonization movements we're going to consider in this unit, let's begin by talking about how state power was shifting after 1900. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, now at the opening of the 20th century, the West dominated the global balance of power. However, by the end of the century, many maritime and land-based empires would fall apart and give rise to new states. And though there are metric buttloads of illustrations I could give you, there are four that you absolutely are required to know, and the first is the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Now remember, in the last period, the Ottoman Empire had already gained itself the unflattering nickname, the sick man of Europe. And even though they had attempted a kind of defensive industrialization program under the Tanzimat reforms, even that didn't get the empire out of the ICU. And so a group emerged during that era known as the Young Ottomans that had been educated in Western ideas and started calling for massive political change that would bring the Ottoman Empire into line with democratic Western powers. And to their great shock, the authoritarian Sultan actually agreed to some of those demands and allowed for the creation of a parliament and a constitution. But sultans be sultans, and as soon as they were threatened with war from Russia, he went ahead and got his authoritarian pants back on and ruled like a proper dictator. And so in response to the revival of authoritarianism, another reform-minded group arose, namely the Young Turks. And they called for a complete modernization of the Ottoman Empire in the image of Western European nations, and after chugging straight from the hose of nationalism, envisioned the Ottoman state as Turkic to the exclusion of many ethnic minorities who lived there. And in 1908, the Young Turks went ahead and overthrew the Sultan, plopped down in the seat of power, and made their reforms. And these included the secularization of schools and law codes, the establishment of political elections, and the imposition of the Turkish language as the official language of the empire. And that's great, right? Like the Ottomans are back, baby! No. You see, by implementing these nationalistic policies, they alienated many of the other minorities within the empire, not least the Arabs. And as a result, those groups experienced their own waves of nationalism, which further fractured the empire. And after the end of World War I, the sick man of Europe would become the dead man of Europe as victorious powers carved up their empire into several independent states. Oh, and the scripture. Okay, next on the list for collapsing empires is the Russian Empire. Now remember that Russia had made some progress in industrialization by the end of the 19th century under the heavy hand of an absolutist czar, namely Alexander II. And his successor, Nicholas II, continued that trend, but as it turns out, the growing middle class that industrialization had created began to resent the czar's authoritarian policies and demanded more of a voice in government decisions. And then right along with their grievances rose the grievances of the working class who had suffered the brutal effects of state-sponsored industrialization. And in the beginning of the 20th century, all those grievances boiled over and we got the Russian Revolution of 1905, which the czar smacked down with brutal force. However, I guess Nicholas was kind of a softie because he did accommodate some of their demands, like the introduction of a constitution, the legalization of labor unions and political parties. But dictators be dictators, and Nicholas largely ignored those reforms and carried on as he always had. And therefore, you might not be surprised to hear that all those tensions that had erupted in the 1905 revolution began to boil yet again. And then World War I came along and cranked up the heat all the way until that kettle was singing with discontent. So the war and the continued difficulties of industrialization then led to the Russian Revolution of 1917, which was led by Marxist visionary Vladimir Lenin, who was a leader of a political group known as the Bolsheviks. And this time, the revolution was successful. Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power, established a communist state, and the Soviet Union was born. And then let's go visit our friends in Qing, China, and see how they're doing. And spoiler alert, it's not good. Now remember from the last unit that throughout the 19th century, China had gotten its hind parts handed to it due to a variety of internal and external factors. Internally, the exceedingly destructive Taiping Rebellion, which though it was eventually put down by Qing authorities, cost millions of lives and enormous amounts of money, which left China depopulated and broke. Externally, China lost both opium wars to Western powers and the Sino-Japanese War to Japan because the half-baked efforts in industrialization in China were no match for the fully baked industrial powers to their east and west. And then things got even worse. At the end of the 19th century, a group known as the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists led an insurrection known as the Boxer Rebellion against the Qing authorities, whom they viewed as foreigners, which, they were. And remember, the Qing were broke as a joke, and so it was in fact the British and the French and the Japanese who sent troops to put down the rebellion. And do you think they did that because they were like, nice guys? Don't be crazy. No, because of their participation in restoring order in China, these foreign powers imposed further demands on a weakened China to their own benefit. And it was at that point that a revolutionary movement gained steam under the Western-educated Sun Yat-sen, which resulted in the abdication of the Qing emperor and the end of 2,000 years of imperial rule in China. And if you wish, you may pause and cry a single tear. I ain't gonna judge you. But anyway, a new provisional government was established under Sun's leadership, but it was short-lived. And after a series of power struggles and civil war, China emerged as a communist state under the leadership of Mao Zedong, and more on that in a later unit. And then finally, we'll finish up our consideration of all these shifts in power by considering the Mexican Revolution, and this one has all sorts of twists and turns, but let me just give you the basics. In the last part of the 19th century and into the first part of the 20th century, Mexico was ruled by a dictator, namely Porfirio Diaz. And his policies angered nearly every social class that existed in Mexico, and they largely banded together to oust him. And so his chief political rival, Francisco Madero, was elected in 1910, but he went ahead and got himself assassinated 2 years later. And what followed was a decade of civil war, which included massive peasant armies led by charismatic figures like Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, but neither of them were successful in seizing any meaningful state power, unlike, say, the Bolsheviks in Russia. But by 1917, the revolution was complete, and Mexico emerged as a republic with a newly drafted constitution, which enacted widespread reforms that addressed the grievances that had led to the revolution in the first place. And some of these reforms included universal male suffrage, minimum wages for workers, a decoupling of the Catholic Church from political and economic power. And this revolution was largely confined to Mexico and didn't have the significant international effects that the Chinese and Russian revolutions had. Okay, click here. All right, the causes of World War I, baby. What are they and why did they, cause World War I? Well, that's what I'm about to explain up real nice. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. And there are, in fact, about 1,000 itty-bitty minor causes that I could tell you about, but we're going to stick to the four main causes. And when I say main, I mean main. First up is militarism, which describes the belief that states ought to build up strong militaries and employ them aggressively to protect their own interests. If you can't make sense out of why that might cause a war, well, then I don't think I can help you. You see, thanks to the incredible productivity of industrial manufacturing that began in the last period, states were able to produce military weapons at a far greater pace than ever before, and bonus, they were way deadlier than ever before. And in the decades leading up to the First World War, the big concern with respect to militarism was Germany. Now, perhaps you'll recall that they got all unified in the last period, and that led to rapid industrialization and a massive buildup of the military. And so in the early decades of the 20th century, those developments merged and resulted in Germany possessing arguably the most powerful military force in Europe. Anyway, all of that made Germany's neighbor France real sweaty under the armpits because due to several internal problems they were dealing with, France's military was pretty pitiful in comparison. But not Great Britain's, baby. You don't build the biggest empire in the world with a pint-sized military. military. But the difference here is that Britain's commitment to militarism drained their national resources at a far greater pace than did Germany. Anyway, militarism, pew pew, cause of World War I. And moving right along, our second cause of World War I was a system of international alliances. So in the beginning of the 20th century, the balance of power on the European continent was expressed in terms of two major alliances. You had the Triple Alliance, which included Germany, Italy, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, among a few others. And then you had the Triple Entente, which included Britain, France, and Russia, among a few others as well. Now, without going too far into the weeds, you just need to understand that these alliances were created in the interest of national security on both sides or to isolate rival states. But how is that a cause of the war? A fine question, which I shall answer presently. You see, both sides, in addition to participating in the warfare buddy system, also devised an elaborate military mobilization plan in case war did break out. And look, with everybody drinking the Kool-Aid of militarism, war is guns to break out. So each state involved in these alliances had built thousands of miles of railroads, and these would be the main vehicle to mobilize their troops in the event of war. But in order to enact mobilization on such a massive scale, these states had to devise incredibly precise timetables for railroad operation. And that means that once mobilization had begun, it would be very difficult to stop it without throwing those countries into chaos. Okay, cause number 3 of World War I was imperialism. So reach into your brain folds and find that spot for Unit 6, and maybe you'll remember that in the last period it was characterized by fantastic imperial expansion. Now, there were a lot of reasons for that, which I don't need to toss around here, but for our purposes, one of the most potent causes for imperialism was the desire to project power on the world stage. Like, getting bigger and better empires was how states achieved great power status, and that led to plenty of competition and conflict. And again, one of the chief agitators here was Germany, who under the influence of its national unity and powerful military sought to enlarge its own empire at the expense of other European powers. And once imperial holdings were secure and there was very little additional territory to conquer, European powers began to experience conflict over existing colonial holdings. And it was this conflict that largely caused the creation of the alliance system. And finally, the fourth cause of World War I was our old friend nationalism. Now, of course, this was carried over from the 19th century, and under its influence, many nation states emphasized the glory and commonality of their own people while defining other nation states as enemies. And as Europeans across the continent embraced nationalistic messages through schools and military service and mass media, this had the effect of convincing them that their national identities and loyalties were the most important thing about them. And even more to the point, nationalistic fervor had a way of convincing them that their national identities were under threat from rival states. All right, class, which of these correctly portrays the British?
That one.
Very good. And what will this monster do to you?
Steal our lunch money and then kill us.
A+. And so, because nationalism was such a powerful and unifying force, that meant that any conflict that began with other powers had to be met with force instead of compromise. Because this guy can't be compromised with, or else your lunch money will be gone and you'll be dead. So those are the main causes of World War I. If you take all 4 of them and put them in a pot, then you've got a stew going that's ready to explode as soon as even a tiny spark falls into the pot. And as it turns out, a tiny spark did fall into the pot, and it happened to be an assassination in the Balkans. You see, a Serbian nationalist by the name of Gavrilo Princip went ahead and shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire over a little regional spat. And here's where all those factors we just talked about come together and cause a catastrophic war out of what should have been a much smaller regional dispute. You see, nationalism caused the Serbian assassination, and nationalism ensured that the Austrians would view it as an unconscionable act that demanded retaliation. And then that's where the alliance system comes into play. Serbia was allied with Russia and Austria-Hungary with Germany. But then Russia was allied with Britain and France, while Germany was allied with Italy. And therefore, when the Serbian-Austro-Hungarian conflict erupted, the entire alliance system lit up, as did the inflexible process of mobilization, and the result was World War I. But we'll have to wait for the next video to see how all that played out. Okay, let's talk about how World War I was fought, and that means things are gonna get real trenchy and real stalemate. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked total war style, then let's get to it. So the first thing you have to know about the fighting of World War I is that this was the world's first total war. And by definition, that's a war which requires the mobilization of a country's entire population, both military and civilian, in order to fight it. And that's kind of a big deal because in the past, there was a pretty clear line between what soldiers were doing out in the battlefield and what civilians were doing back home. But in total war, every last schmo in the country is required to contribute in some way to the war effort. And to make things more devastating, in a total war, even civilians were considered viable targets for military efforts. Anyway, as you may have guessed, waging a total war is not easy, so you're gonna need to understand that governments use various strategies to keep morale up among the troops in the battlefield and civilians back home. And the chief strategy that you need to know is that governments used all kinds of propaganda to motivate everyone to keep making the necessary sacrifices. And these propaganda campaigns demonized enemies and often exaggerated the atrocities that the enemies were committing. So the goal was to remind everyone involved in the war that their own cause amounted to a righteous struggle against evil forces, and therefore whatever sacrifice was demanded was worth it. I mean, look at this guy. He's gonna insult your mother, eat your children, and then deliberately hurt your feelings. And so for all the states involved in World War I, they went bonkers producing this kind of material in the form of art and various media, including newsreels and posters and pamphlets. Now, one aspect of these propaganda campaigns that you really need to remember is that they used intensified forms of nationalism in order to get their messages across. Remember from the last video that nationalism was a big cause of this war. People in various states began to view the world as kind of like a collection of enemy rivals, and that their national identities were the most important thing about them. So much of this propaganda capitalized on these nationalist sentiments in order to generate fear of foreign enemies and pride in a nation's own people. Okay, now let's turn the corner and talk about the general trends that describe how World War I was fought. And look, I could talk all day about Germany's Schlieffen Plan or the various battles that get military historians all tingly, but you really only need to know one basic fact and a few ways to illustrate it. And that fact is this: new military technologies made World War I one of the deadliest wars in human history. Now, some of those technologies included machine guns and chemical gas and tanks, just to name a few. But it wasn't just technology that made this war deadly, it was also the nature of how they were used. And here's where I tell you about the main feature of fighting, namely trench warfare. Now, to understand this, let me give you a little context. In the beginning of the war, generals consulted the past for winning strategies and found that victory always went to the first mover and those who leveraged the most spirited attacks. Therefore, French and British armies charged across the field to fight Germans, but they were met with thousands of rounds of machine gun fire, which led to massive casualties. So it wasn't long before generals on both sides changed tactics to avoid such bloody encounters. And that tactic is what we call trench warfare, in which each side dug miles of trenches opposite each other and hunkered down for protection. Now, to be clear, trench warfare was not a new strategy invented for this war, but the scale of it outstripped anything that came before. And it was precisely fighting from the trenches that caused so many casualties in World War I. Each side hid in their trenches, which were fortified with machine guns and barbed wire. And if one side came out of their trenches and charged, they would be mowed down by machine guns or otherwise caught in the barbed wire, and the same with the other side. Therefore, this situation led to years of stalemates where casualties mounted, but neither side made much progress. And so what everyone believed would be a quick war turned into a years-long effort. And with so many men dying on the field, that's when this war became truly global in scope. Remember that the states fighting this war, like Great Britain and France and Germany, had spent a great deal of effort over over the course of the last period, building up massive colonial empires. And so what's an imperial state to do when all of its own men are dying on the battlefield? You call up colonial troops to fight your war. And so these various imperial powers mustered troops from Africa, India, China, Southeast Asia, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and many more colonial men were conscripted as porters in the war whose job it was to carry military equipment to various locations. And look, you don't have to be a historical genius to understand that colonial people who had been dominated and exploited by their imperial overlords weren't that excited to go fight this war that had nothing to do with them. And yet they did it in hopes that such sacrifices would help them gain independence, or at least a greater degree of self-rule after the war. And maybe it won't surprise you by now, but that didn't really work out, and it's going to cause all kinds of problems for imperial powers, but we'll save that for another video. Anyway, the war dragged on for 4 years and left an awful lot of destruction in its wake. But a key turning point was the entry of the United States on the side of the Allied powers, namely Britain and France, in 1917. Now, initially, when the war broke out, the US wanted to remain neutral, but Germany had a habit of sinking ships with Americans on them and got sassy enough to try to incite Mexico to start a war with the US to keep them otherwise occupied. And all those factors eventually dragged the US into the war, and with the fresh surge of troops backed by the might of American industry, the tide turned against Germany and the Central Powers. So the war officially ended in 1918 with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Germany and the Central Powers had lost while the Allied powers had won. And despite American President Woodrow Wilson's attempts to forge peace without victory among the belligerents of the war, France and Britain used the treaty to punish Germany, which would play a major role in the causes of World War II. But again, that's a story for another video. Okay, World War I is over and everything is puppies and rainbows. And by puppies and rainbows, I mean generalized economic disaster worldwide that'll play a big role in whipping up yet another world war. So let's talk about it. And if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. And with all the economic crises that we're going to consider in this video, what you really need to focus on is how governments got involved in trying to solve those crises. And just for poops and giggles, why don't we start with Germany, because they had it in a bad way. Now, you might remember that the Treaty of Versailles required Germany to pay reparations for the damage that they caused, which ended up being a lot of money. Additionally, Germany put most of their war spending on their credit card, so to speak. And they assumed that by winning the war and annexing resource-rich lands, they were going to be able to pay that back. But as it turned out, the winning the war part of the equation didn't work out so well. And that means Germany, in addition to paying reparations, was into debt up to their German nose hairs. And so in the face of such crushing expectations, the German government did what any rational government would do: they started printing more money. And when that happened, the value of the German mark plummeted precipitously, and that led the German economy into something called hyperinflation. Let me try to illustrate to you just how bad it got. You know how when you go to another country, you have to exchange your money in order to get their money? Well, by November of 1923, if I went to Germany with $1 in my hand and went to exchange it, I would have gotten back 4.2 trillion marks. Like in 1922, a German could buy a loaf of bread for 160 marks, but by 1923, that same loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. That's a lot of marks, Tony. Now, this hyperinflation situation didn't only affect Germany. Remember, they owed money to powers like Britain and France in the form of reparations. But when Germany couldn't pay them, Britain and France struggled to repay their own war debts to the United States. Add to that, the Soviets weren't paying back their war debts either, because they went ahead and had a communist revolution and decided that old debts didn't belong to the new Bolshevik government. Additionally, colonial governments suffered too, because they had come to depend on the economies of their parent countries. And so colonial governments in Africa, Asia, and Latin America all got thrown into this giant economic turd stew, and as my grandpappy used to say, once there's a turd in the stew, ain't nobody gonna eat it. Oh, long story short, by 1924, the economic situation was stabilized and Germany borrowed money from US banks in order to make their reparations payments to Britain and France. And that led to the rapid economic recovery of all involved. To which I say, phew, I really hope another worldwide economic collapse isn't looming on the horizon to put the kibosh on all that stability. You know, foreshadow. But for now, let's head over to the Soviet Union to see how their economic situation is faring. Now remember that Russia had exited World War I during the Russian Revolution of 1917, but not before their involvement in the war kind of devastated their economy. And so in response, Vladimir Lenin got the new communist government involved and instituted the new economic policy in 1923. Now in essence, this introduced some limited free market principles into the Soviet economy, even while the biggest institutions remained under state control. Now to be clear, free market was a dirty word in the Soviet Union. Like if this video was being played in the Soviet Union during the 1920s, they'd probably censor me when I said free market. But Lenin allowed himself to get a little dirty in the filth of capitalism because he needed the economic breathing room to complete the communist revolution. Anyway, there was some limited success with the new economic policy, but Lenin went ahead and died in 1924, and those economic policies kind of died with him. But don't worry, because in his place, the authoritarian turd Joseph Stalin assumed power, and he would get all kinds of involved with the economy. You see, Stalin wanted the Soviet Union to industrialize quick, fast, and in a hurry. And to that end, he introduced a series of 5-year plans which aimed to multiply Soviet industrial capacity by 5 in as many years. Now, that was a very short time period for such large goals, and the only way to accomplish it was with a strong armed state bent on brutality, which, as it turned out, was Stalin's specialty. Therefore, in order to supply the newly created and rapidly growing industrial centers with food, Stalin enacted a collectivization of agriculture. This involved merging small privately owned farms into large sprawling collective farms owned by the state. And nearly all of the produce of the land would be shipped to feed industrial workers in the cities. Now, the wealthy landowning class known as the kulaks resisted this collectivization bitterly. But Stalin ordered them arrested to the tune of about 8 million and either executed them or sent them to hard labor camps. And after that, all that was left was the peasantry, who did not possess the managerial skills of the kulaks and therefore were unable to match production quotas set by the state. And nowhere were the effects of this collectivization felt more acutely than in Ukraine, which was by far the most significant producer of grain in the whole Soviet Union. So the 1932-33 harvest was only about half of what it had been in the years before. But Stalin's obsession with feeding industrial centers meant that even what Ukrainian farmers did produce was exported to feed urban workers. And that left them with almost no food for themselves, and Stalin's policies prohibited them from leaving their homes, which turned out to be a death sentence. The result was that millions starved to death, and the event became known as the Holodomor, or death by hunger. Okay, so yeah, things are a little rough economically speaking across the world. But the one bright glimmer of hope in all this darkness was the booming economy of the United States that was helping prop up a lot of other economies recovering from World War I. But then in 1929, the US stock market crashed, which plunged America into the Great Depression. However, since several European economies were reliant on investment from America in order to rebuild after World War I, the US's inability to continue that funding meant that the Great Depression would become a worldwide phenomenon. Now, for many years, the US government was very hands-off with respect to the economy, but the mounting woes of the Great Depression changed all of that big time. And that occurred under the freshly elected president named Franklin D. Roosevelt, who worked quickly to roll out hundreds of government-sponsored policies that combined became known as the New Deal. And under the New Deal, the government put people to work on infrastructure projects, introduced a government-sponsored retirement program, created government medical insurance for the elderly and for children, and on and on. And whether it would have worked to turn the economy around is up for debate, because by 1939, World War II would break out and solve all the US's economic hardships almost overnight. Okay, so yeah, World War I is over, and that's great and all, but as it turns out, the end of the war created the conditions for all kinds of tension throughout the world, especially with respect to colonial peoples and their desire to expunge imperial powers from their land. So I reckon we ought to talk about it, and if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, now despite the fact that colonial people fought in World War I, the victorious powers did not see fit to reward those sacrifices with independence and self-rule. In fact, on the whole, European powers and the Japanese maintained their colonial holdings in the interwar period, and in some cases, states gained colonial territory as a result of the war. Now, to be fair, some new states did emerge after the war, most notably the Republic of Turkey under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, better known as Ataturk. But, and I cannot emphasize this enough, in many places, colonial territory just switched hands from one imperial power to another, and here's where I introduce you to the mandate system in the Middle East. So, at the Paris Peace Conference that ended World War I, victorious powers aimed to dismantle the Ottoman and German empires and divided those colonial territories among themselves as just spoils for war. Oh, and by the way, if you want no guides to follow along with this video and all my videos, check the link in the description. Anyway, the ultimate imperial party foul was committed by US President Woodrow Wilson, who kept insisting during the peace negotiations that self-determination ought to be the guiding principle of a post-war world. And by that, he meant that states should have the right to govern themselves. And many colonial peoples around the world took this to mean that the outcome of the peace conference would lead to the freedom and independence of colonial holdings everywhere. But as it turns out, the French and the British were in no mood to sip from Wilson's idealistic rainbow milkshake and largely refused his ideas. However, they couldn't just tell Woodrow to shut up and go eat a sandwich in the corner. So the compromise they made in the Middle East was known as the mandate system. And under this system, Middle Eastern territories would become mandates administered by the League of Nations, and they created a three-tiered structure to classify these territorial holdings. Class C mandates had the smallest populations and were considered the least developed, and thus they were treated essentially as colonies. Several islands in the Pacific fit this category and were taken over by the British and the Japanese. Class B mandates had larger populations and were still considered underdeveloped and therefore would be ruled by the victorious powers because, they weren't ready for self-determination. And most of Germany's colonies in Africa fell under this heading and were divided among the victorious powers. And then Class A mandates had large populations and sufficient levels of development so that they were deemed suitable for independence and self-rule. But come on, that's not how it actually played out. No, the British occupied Israel and Iraq while the French occupied Syria and Lebanon, treating them no different than colonies. And remember, many of the people in these colonial holdings interpreted the end of the war to be their ticket to freedom. So when they got out from one imperial thumb only to find a different imperial thumb descending upon them, that, not surprisingly, led to fierce anti-colonial resistance. Okay, we'll get back to that, but first we need to consider the expansion of Japan's empire in the interwar years. Now remember that Japan was kind of an outlier in the world imperial party since it was the only non-Western state to make themselves equal to Western power. And now that Japan had a place at the table of power, they did what powerful industrial nations did. They got an empire, baby! And so in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria in order to expand its empire and gain access to valuable natural resources. And that was a flagrant violation of the rules established by the League of Nations, but unfortunately the League didn't have much power to enforce its rules and just resorted to some heavy finger wagging. So in response, Japan went ahead and quit the League of Nations and continued right on with its program of conquest in the Pacific. And so to that end, by 1932, Japan had taken over a part of China and created a puppet state called Manchukuo. And then throughout the interwar period, Japan would continue to seize territory throughout the Pacific and dubbed its area of influence the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Okay, now I said before that the dashed hopes of colonial people everywhere with respect to independence after the war led to various anti-imperial resistance movements, and I'll mention two. First was the creation of the Indian National Congress in, India, which was a British colony. It was formed before the war in the late 19th century for the purpose of formally petitioning the British government for greater degrees of self-rule in India. But Britain be Britain, and despite some weak concessions to the Congress's request, British domination continued basically unchanged in India, even after millions of Indian soldiers fought for the British cause in World War I. Now, the tide would begin to turn in the 1920s when Mohandas Gandhi became a significant leader in the Congress and would lead Indians in various acts of potent but peaceful protest against British policies. Those acts of resistance would ultimately result in independence, though not until after the Second World War. Then the second example of anti-imperial resistance was the formation of the African National Congress. It was founded in South Africa by Western-educated lawyers and journalists and dedicated itself to obtaining equal rights for colonial subjects in South Africa. And it was influenced by the ideas of Pan-Africanism, which aimed for the equality and unity of all black people across the world. And again, same story here. The African National Congress did admirable work in opposing especially imperial racial policies, but they wouldn't be fully successful until after World War II. In fact, the people who lived through World War I called it the war to end all wars. But like the first Terminator movie, it turned out to be only a prequel to the much more explosive sequel, namely World War II.
I'll be back.
So I reckon we ought to talk about the causes of World War II, and if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. So as you may recall from the video on 7.3, World War I was officially ended by the Treaty of Versailles, and that treaty was the diplomatic equivalent of a turd sandwich. The victorious powers, especially Britain and France, were real saucy about the war and wrote the terms of it with vengeance in their hearts, which turned out to be real upsetting to both Italy and Germany, and let's look at both. So Italy was bitter after the war because they didn't receive the land that they were promised in Austria and the Ottoman Empire. You see, before the war broke out, Italy was allied with Germany, but when the Allied powers promised these land grants if Italy would join their side, they broke the alliance and fought against Germany. But as it turns out, the Allied powers almost immediately regretted this offer because Italy turned out to be about as useful as an inflatable dartboard. Like, they were always asking for more resources, and they botched some of their most crucial engagements. Therefore, in the peace settlements, Britain and France decided to withhold all the land that was promised to Italy before the war, and that's going to make at least one Italian real sassy. Oh, and by the way, if you want note guys to follow along with this video and all my videos, check the link in the description. Anyway, let's move on to Germany and see how the peace agreement sat with them. And spoiler alert, it was not good. And there were three stipulations in particular that left Germany deeply disaffected. First, the treaty required Germany to pay reparations to the victorious powers, and if you remember from the last video, that played a significant role in plunging Germany into hyperinflation and general economic disaster. Second, the treaty mandated the demilitarization of Germany, which left them unable to defend themselves against other militarized powers. And third, and sauciest of them all, was the war guilt clause, which saddled the entire blame for the war on Germany alone. And that clause was engineered by the British and the French and really served only one purpose: to humiliate Germany on the world stage. And that's going to make at least one German real angry. Okay, now the second cause of World War II is rooted in continued imperialist aspirations around the world. For example, Japan got his big boy pants on and started expanding into China and various islands in the Pacific. And that got the League of Nations all pouty, but they really had no power to stop them. And then Italy, having been denied any territorial gains after World War I, went ahead and started expanding its empire on its own. And to that end, Italy invaded Ethiopia and conquered it and consolidated all its other colonial holdings on the African continent into a formal Italian empire. And then Germany, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, decided they were going to start expanding as well, first by claiming lands taken from them in the Treaty of Versailles and then beyond. So first, Germany took back the Rhineland, which the treaty set up as a buffer buffer zone between them and France. Then they expanded into Czechoslovakia and Austria, all in the name of getting a little Lebensraum, which when being translated means living space. And as Hitler's taken over the whole dang European continent with his aggressive militarism, Britain and France weren't doing anything to stop him. And I guess it's kind of understandable because, they didn't want to start another stinking world war. But this policy of appeasement just proved to Hitler that he could kind of do anything he wanted without any consequences from Western powers. And the third cause of World War II was the profound economic crises during the interwar period. Now, I already covered all that in detail in the video on 7.4, so here I'll just rehash the basics. The Great Depression, which started in the United States and then spread to much of the world, meant that the populations in many countries were unemployed and hungry. And so, when people are in that sorry state, they were plenty ripe to be swept away by authoritarian strongmen who made promises to make everything better. And that leads us nicely to our fourth cause of World War II, namely the rise of fascist and totalitarian regimes, and for this we'll take a little tour around the world. Our first stop is in the Soviet Union. So remember that in 1917 the Russian Revolution successfully transformed Russia into a communist state, namely the Soviet Union. And after Vladimir Lenin died, a brutal dictator named Joseph Stalin rose to power. Now, I already talked about Stalin's grade A turdishness in a previous video, but here you just need to understand why Stalin worried Western powers, and it really came down to this. Like Lenin before him, Stalin's rhetoric and his actions proclaimed that he wasn't satisfied for communism to remain a Soviet reality. No, Stalin would not rest until the entire world was made in the image of communism, and that made Western powers more than a little twitchy. And then came the birth of fascism in Italy. Now, by definition, fascism is a political philosophy characterized by extreme nationalism, authoritarian leadership, and militaristic means to achieve its goals. And as a result of their disaffection after World War I and their profound suffering during the Great Depression, Benito Mussolini rose to power and established a fascist state in Italy. And so he organized all of Italy to serve his own vision for the state. And while his policies did lower standards of living for many people, he did provide state-funded social security and many public services. And to people suffering the devastating effects of the Depression, this was a welcomed relief. Additionally, Mussolini used his oratorical skills to deliver rousing nationalistic speeches glorifying the Italian people and the Italian culture. And he organized massive nationalistic parades and used mass communication technologies to effectively rouse public support for his policies and make Italy great on the world stage. And then let's visit Germany, the most fascist and turdish of them all. So fascism took hold there under the influence of the Nazi Party under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. And like Mussolini, Hitler was a spellbinding orator and used mass communication technologies to spread his ultra-nationalistic messages of German greatness. And in these speeches, Hitler defined for the German people a common enemy that was the root of all their problems, namely socialist, communist, and perhaps most notably, Jews. And look, before the Nazi Party became a synonym for pure evil, their policies did improve standards of living for many Germans suffering the effects of unemployment and hunger. And it was precisely Hitler's ability to put language to Germany's humiliation and suffering that made his cure so compelling, and it essentially had four parts. First, Germany would cancel its reparations payments since that had sunk them into economic hardship. Second, Hitler made plans to remilitarize Germany in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Like, not only would this allow Germany to project strength again, but it would solve their economic problems by focusing on war production. Third, as I mentioned earlier, Hitler aimed to get that sweet Lebensraum for the German people. And then fourth and darkest of them all, Hitler made plans to eliminate all races and all people deemed impure according to Hitler's racialist ideology, and the group that suffered the worst under this effort was the Jews. And all of that combined led us straight into World War II, and I'll tell you about how that worked out in the next video. Okay, it's time to talk about how World War II was fought. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked totalitarian style, let's get to it. Now, remember when we talked about World War I mentioned that it was what we call a total war, which is a war that requires the mobilization of a country's entire population, both military and civilian, in order to fight. Additionally, in total war, civilians are considered every bit as legitimate a target as our military target. And so World War II had all the same total war DNA as the First World War, except more so because it was bigger and more devastating in every way. Oh, and by the way, if you want note guys to follow along with this video and all my videos, check the link in the description. So I won't rehash the causes of the war here since we did that in the last video, but here I'll just tell you that the most immediate cause of the war was Hitler's invasion of Poland. Recall that Hitler was all about getting himself and the German people some Lebensraum, which is to say living space. And so he went ahead and started conquering and annexing territory all over Europe. And not wanting to start another world-stinking war, Britain and France just kind of let it happen under the policies of appeasement. But on September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and that was enough to smack Western powers in the face and wake them up to the fact that Hitler aimed to take over the whole dang world if someone didn't stop it. And so the war began, and like in World War I, an alliance system formed into two rival sides. The Axis powers included Germany, Italy, and Japan, who were all fascist brothers from another mother. And then there were the Allied powers, which included Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States. And to be clear, the Soviets and the Americans weren't involved on the Allied side at the beginning, but they would enter later. In fact, the Soviets were somewhat allied to Germany in the beginning because they signed a non-aggression pact, but later Hitler decided that he was tired of being non-aggressive toward the stinking Soviet communists that he hated, and so he invaded the Soviet Union. And that sent the Soviets squarely into alliance with Britain and France. And the United States was just having a little isolationist me time across the Atlantic, but still providing money and munitions to Britain. But then Japan went ahead and bombed the US naval base at Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941, and that brought the Americans into the war on the side of the Allies. Okay, so now that you know who was fighting, let's talk about what strategies those governments used to mobilize for this next iteration of total war. And look, I'd love to tell you that we're going to consider in detail some of the main and most dramatic battles of the war, of which there were many, but here's where I tell you that for the purposes of this course, you don't really need to know any of that. What's more important here is that you understand that in general, there were many continuities with World War I and how governments prepared for and waged this war. And then most of the changes just had to do with the scope of the war and how deadly it was. So just like in the First World War, governments used various tactics to mobilize their own populations as well as colonial troops for the war. First up was the use of propaganda. Once again, governments used propaganda in various forms to provoke nationalism in its people and to demonize their enemies. And by sowing fear, they were able to assemble massive armies and keep civilians sacrificing on the home front. Second, governments leaned heavily on various ideologies to wage this war, and let's compare three of these ideologies. First up was fascism, which remember is all about the glorification of the state and the use of militaristic means to accomplish that glorification. So as I said before, Japan, Germany, and Italy were all fascist states. And though they weren't all exactly the same flavor of fascism, in general, they handled mobilization and waging war in similar ways. You see, fascist states were organized politically and economically in order to serve the interests not of the people, but of the state. Therefore, with its blend of extreme nationalism and the glorification of military conflict, fascist states were able to marshal their whole economies and populations quickly and efficiently in order to mobilize for war. For example, Hitler made use of all the people he conquered in his lust for Lebensraum to serve the war effort. He established labor camps all across the German Reich where Jews and Slavs and other people that Hitler deemed subhuman were forced into brutal coerced labor projects to support the war. And then the second ideology we'll throw into the comparison was communism. Now remember what we learned in a previous video about the mustachioed totalitarian turd Joseph Stalin. Now, before the war even began, he had already organized the Soviet economy to serve his own interest, which consisted chiefly in rapid industrialization through his 5-year plans, and those, to put it mildly, led to catastrophic amounts of suffering. But when it came time to mobilize for World War II, Stalin pressed these demands of collectivization and industrialization even further, requiring munitions factories and farmers to increase their output in service of the war with brutal and unflinching demands. And then third, let's consider how the ideology of democracy was leveraged in service of the war. So by the time the war began, Great Britain had a new prime minister, namely Winston Churchill. And Churchill was in no mood to act like a limp, overcooked noodle like his predecessor Neville Chamberlain had, what with all the appeasement nonsense. No, Churchill was nicknamed the Bulldog because he was in the mood to chomp down hard on Hitler's hindparts and crush the Third Reich under his golden haunches. But Great Britain was not a totalitarian state, so Churchill could not control his people and Britain's economy like a dictator. So when it came time to mobilize for war and keep the war effort going, Churchill had to rely more on persuasion and the cooperation of his people. To that end, propaganda campaigns dubbed it as a people's war, and the government made promises to the people to expand the welfare state in exchange for their wartime sacrifices. Okay, now the third and final category of comparison between the First and Second World Wars was the repression of basic freedoms, and this occurred in varying degrees across fascist, communist, and democratic nations. In the United States, for example, following the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, more than 100,000 Japanese Americans, a large portion of whom were American citizens, were forced into internment camps because the government feared that they were operatives for the enemy. In Germany, Jews and other undesirables were forced into ghettos as a result of the Nuremberg laws, and then later into concentration camps where they would be forced into hard labor or systematically killed. And there are so many other examples, but those two are enough for our purposes. Okay, now finally we need to talk about the new strategies and technologies that made this the deadliest war in history, and I'm going to give you 2 strategies and 1 new technology. The first new strategy was pioneered by Germany. It was known as Blitzkrieg, which was a shock and awe strategy that aimed to eliminate the enemy with incredible speed, and basically combined air assault from planes and quick infantry movement from tanks and other armored vehicles. Therefore, the trench warfare that characterized World War I was essentially obsolete. Okay, the second strategy to know was called firebombing. Now, when you think of a bomb, you probably think of something like this that does a bunch of damage with a singular blast. But firebombs were small clusters of explosive devices that were meant to fall in urban areas and not do damage necessarily with a big blast, but by starting fires. And so the Allied forces firebombed many urban areas, but none more devastating than Dresden in Germany and Tokyo in Japan. And between these 2 campaigns, hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed in massive fires that were so hot they created their own weather system. And finally, the most significant new technology you need to know for World War II was the invention of the atomic bomb developed by the United States. And by destabilizing particles on the atomic level, a single blast from this bomb could destroy an entire city. And the US dropped 2 of these bombs on largely civilian areas in Japan, one on Hiroshima and the other on Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands of people. And the result was the surrender of Japan and the end of the war in the Pacific. And in the end, the Allied powers prevailed both in Europe and in the Pacific, and with the unthinkable destruction and death caused by this war, there was never an armed conflict in world history again. Which is a big fat lie, but that story's gonna have to wait till Unit 8. Okay, well, I admit this is not going to be fun, but you still have to know about the mass atrocities that occurred throughout the 20th century. So myself, and let's look squarely at the profound horrors that humans are capable of. Now, unfortunately, humans found more ways to kill each other in the 20th century than in any other century in our collective history. One major cause of death was the 2 world wars, which combined led to a total of about 120 million deaths on the upper end of the estimates. And something like half of those deaths were civilians that perished through bombings and famine. And then another major cause of atrocities was new technology. For example, World War II ushered in the perfection of aerial warfare, which included the horrifying reality of firebombing, which set entire urban areas on fire and killed hundreds of thousands in their wake. Also, the atomic bomb was responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But by far the most sinister cause of mass atrocities in the 20th century was the rise of extremist political ideologies which aim to destroy entire populations on account of race or ethnicity. And for the rest of the video, we're going to consider 3 examples of these. And look, side note here, I know there are so many atrocities that should be named, and justice requires that they are named, and that the dead are honored in these, and I know it's almost criminal not to mention them, but for the sake of this curriculum, I'm just going to handle these 3. So the first major atrocity in this category occurred in the beginning of the 20th century, namely the Armenian genocide. Now remember that in 1950 to 1916, the Ottoman Empire began a program of revisioning their state as primarily Turkic under the influence of the Young Turks, and that cast suspicion on the large Armenian Christian population. Additionally, since they were in the midst of World War I, Ottoman authorities feared that the Armenians might support invading enemy armies against the empire. Therefore, Ottoman authorities began a program of mass extermination that included outright slaughter of Armenians as well as forcible relocation in which the people were malnourished and brutalized. And in the end, somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million Armenians were killed in the Ottoman genocide. And then during World War II, some of the most profound human suffering occurred at the hands of Nazi Germany. You see, a key ingredient in Hitler's extreme form of German nationalism was the desire to create a purified German race, and therefore he used his power to exterminate all the groups that he believed tarnished that purity. And it was a program known as the Final Solution, and though it targeted the Roma and homosexuals and disabled people, political enemies, and several other groups, by far the group who felt the hardest blow of this policy was the Jewish population. Before the war began, the Nazis enacted the Nuremberg laws, which stripped the rights of Jews and forced them into ghettos where they were marginalized, abused, and brutalized. But once the war began, Hitler made use of industrial technologies to construct concentration camps where Jews were sent for hard labor, and extermination camps where they were sent to be murdered with industrial precision and efficiency. And the largest of these camps was called Auschwitz, and at its height, 12,000 people were killed every day by means of large-scale gas chambers. And in the end, about 6 million Jews were put to death in this way, and about 5 million people that belonged to the other targeted groups died as well. And finally, in the later part of the 20th century, we have the Cambodian genocide. So at the end of the 1970s, a communist group called the Khmer Rouge took power in Cambodia under the leadership of Pol Pot. And with China's support, Pol Pot began a program to transform Cambodia into an agrarian state and completely erase any remnants of Western influence. And therefore, he emptied the cities and forced people to work in labor camps and targeted the education population who were most influenced by Western ideas for extermination. And while Pol Pot's program wasn't as clearly racially motivated like the atrocities in Nazi Germany and the Ottoman Empire, it was still responsible for the death of about a quarter of the Cambodian population. And with that, we've reached the end of Unit 7, and I'll see you in Unit 8. I wish I could tell you that things got happier in that unit, but A hearty welcome to Unit 8, y'all, and really there are only two developments that we're going to consider in this unit, the Cold War and decolonization. But both are massive and ridiculously complicated, but don't worry. In this video, we're just setting the stage for these two developments. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, first, as is proper, let's start with a definition. A Cold War describes a state of hostility that exists between two states chiefly characterized by an ideological struggle rather than open warfare. But that's just a Cold War in general. The Cold War was a standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union that transformed global politics for about 4 decades after World War II. So let me get this straight. World War I was called the war to end all wars, but then we got the even more devastating and deadly World War II, which definitely should have ended all wars, and then before the ink was dry on the peace treaty, we've got the Cold War? What in the fresh heck is going on? Well, the Allied powers won World War II, but as it turns out, the enormous cost and destruction of that war meant that they weren't as much leaping in victory as limping away from victory and trying not to bleed out everywhere. However, in the wake of that devastation, two global superpowers emerged from the war, namely the United States and the Soviet Union, and they were ready to flex their post-war pectorals on the world stage. But, says you, why did those two states emerge as superpowers while the other victorious powers were the equivalent of a damp ham sandwich? An excellent question, and there are two reasons. Their economic and technological advantages. Before I tell you what description. Okay, so let's start with the economic advantages that led to the rise of these two superpowers, and just for poops and giggles, let's consider the United States first. So, although the United States suffered profoundly during the Great Depression in the 1930s, mobilization for World War II created the occasion for a complete economic turnaround as much of their industrial sector ramped up to meet wartime production demand. Additionally, aside from the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, the US experienced almost none of the destructive consequences of the war, unlike European countries whose cities lay in ruins and who now had to face the monumental and expensive task of rebuilding. And so, put all that in a pot and baby, you got a stew going, and that stew smells like the United States becoming the most prosperous nation in the world. Which of course means it's time to pause and high-five a bald eagle. Anyway, one of the most momentous results of the US's post-war prosperity was their ability to help pay for the rebuilding of Western European nations through programs like the Marshall Plan. Through this plan, the US sent over $13 billion in aid for economic recovery in war-torn nations, and on the whole, the nations that received those funds experienced their own economic revival. And so, now that Americans became the geopolitical equivalent of a Fortnite loot llama for much of the world, that meant that the global balance of power shifted decisively toward the United States. But over in the Soviet Union, it was kind of a different story. Now, recall what we learned back in Unit 7, namely that since the 1920s, the Soviet economy was heavily directed by the state. And although that kind of command economy drew all sorts of skepticism from more free market-minded folks in the years leading up to World War II, the Soviet economy did grow pretty rapidly, even if that growth led to the suffering and death of millions of Soviet citizens. But unlike the United States, the Soviet Union was hit hard by World War II, not least by Hitler's attempted invasion and siege of Leningrad. Even so, after the war, the centralized command economy of the Soviet Union had the benefit of drawing natural resources from its enormous territory, not to mention a comparatively large population, to work towards economic recovery. And thanks to the government's large-scale investment in heavy industry before World War II, much of the infrastructure they needed for recovery was already in place, and it wasn't long before the Soviet Union was economically powerful again. Although later in the century, their emphasis on coal extraction and steel production at the expense of the production of consumer goods would contribute to a weakening economy. But for now, they're doing just fine. So yeah, economics played a big role in these two states becoming superpowers in this period, but so did their technological advantages. The United States developed the most advanced and devastating technology of the war, namely the atomic bomb, and their deployment of 2 of those bombs on Japan effectively ended the war in the Pacific theater. And the effect of this display of new technology made it clear to the rest of the world that the United States was the technological king on the global map. But the Soviet Union, not content to stand in the technological shadow of the stupid Americans, reacted quickly and developed their own atomic weapons, the first of which was tested in 1949, just 4 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that led to one of the most defining characteristics of the Cold War, namely an arms race in which both powers spent stupid amounts of money to develop bigger and more destructive bombs. And now that both powers had enough nuclear and hydrogen bombs to reduce the Earth to a charred pile of space ash in a moment, it was clear who was in charge on the global stage. Okay, now let's set the stage for the second major development in this period, namely decolonization. Like, for a good chunk of this course, we've been talking about how various imperial states have built up empires all over the world, and in this period, we're going to witness a complete reversal of that trend. And in truth, it was the 2 world wars that created the conditions for decolonization. Now, recall that the imperial powers that fought in World War I called up millions of troops from their colonial holdings to help them win the war. And though they really had no choice in the matter, many colonial troops fought for their imperial parents' cause, hoping that their sacrifices would be honored with a greater degree of self-rule or even independence. And then adding to this desire was Woodrow Wilson's insistence in the peace conference that self-determination for all nations should be the guiding principle after the war. However, after the war, many colonies of the defeated power simply changed hands to the victorious powers. And through the mandate system, the victorious powers claimed that they were organizing colonies around the world into a hierarchical system with varying degrees of self-rule based on their ability to sustain themselves. However, in practice, the mandate system essentially continued the colonial system unchanged, and that made colonial peoples more than a little saucy. But it was World War II that really set the process of decolonization in motion. Again, colonial troops fought for their imperial parents' cause, but this time after the war was over and there appeared to be no clear intention of the imperial countries to grant independence to their colonies, massive anti-imperial movements broke out across the world. However, the difference this time was that imperial states like Britain and France and the rest had almost no resources to resist these movements. The war had devastated their economies and their militaries were severely weakened on account of World War II. Therefore, after 1945, these developments would lead to a worldwide process of decolonization which broke apart colonial empires and created something like 80 new states on the world map. The Cold War, baby. What caused it and what effects did it have? Well, if that's the question you're asking, then you have found the right video, my dear pupil. So, if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, before we jump right into the causes, let me just define what we mean by Cold War in case you missed it in the last video. A Cold War describes a state of hostility that exists between two states chiefly characterized by an ideological struggle rather than open warfare. And the particular Cold War that we're talking about is between the United States and the Soviet Union. So the first cause of the standoff was conflicting ideologies between the two superpowers, namely the democratic capitalism of the United States and the authoritarian communism of the Soviet Union. So democratic capitalism emphasizes free market economics and political participation from citizens, but authoritarian communism emphasizes strict government control control of the economy and redistribution of wealth equally to all citizens who have essentially no voice in the government. Oh, by the way, if you want note guys to follow along with this video and all my videos, then check the link in the description. Okay, so clearly those two ideologies are at odds with one another. But why in the fresh heck, says you, would those ideologies create enough tension to alter global geopolitics for the last half of the 20th century? I mean, Americans, you do you. Soviets, you also do you. Well, ultimately, the problem is that neither of these ideologies are built on a you do you and I do me principle. Both ideologies are universalizing ideas, meaning that those who hold them want everyone else to hold them as well. The US wasn't satisfied to keep democracy to themselves, nor were the Soviets satisfied to keep communism to themselves. Each ideology could only prove its superior worth once every square inch of the planet was conformed to one ideology or the other. So yeah, since the US and the Soviet Union were the two great superpowers of this age, it's not surprising that their desire to spread democracy or communism throughout the world would cause some problems. But then the second cause of the Cold War was the mutual mistrust that existed between two powers, and that mistrust started even before World War II had ended. You see, before the end of the war, the three big powers, the US, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, met together at a series of conferences to discuss plans for the post-war world. And they basically all agreed that Central and Eastern European countries would be able to hold free elections after the war was over. If that smells like democracy to you, then your sniffer is working just fine. But that presented a big fat problem to the Soviet Union, which bordered those states, namely that if those states were democratic and capitalist, well, then they wouldn't be communist. And remember, both of these ideologies want to make the whole world over in their own image. So Joseph Stalin decided to keep those countries under Soviet control to act as a buffer zone between Russia and Europe. Therefore, all those nations became communist in short order and served the purposes of the Soviet Union. The US, not surprisingly, saw this as a flagrant violation of their agreement to allow these nations the right of self-determination and democracy. So mutual mistrust unlocked. But then they also tangled over Germany, and that led to further antagonism between the two superpowers. So after the war, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, one of which went to the Soviet Union, and then the French and the British and the United States respectively. And that occupation was meant to be temporary, but again, Stalin refused to set Eastern Germany free, and it quickly became another communist satellite state of the Soviet Union. And it was all of these territorial divisions that led former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to proclaim that an Iron Curtain had fallen across Europe. Therefore, guided by conflicting ideologies and growing mistrust, the Cold War began and would last for the next 4 decades. However, the implications of this conflict were much larger than the two superpowers alone. In fact, the effects of this conflict reached into nearly every last part of the stinking world. Now, we'll talk more about the effects of the Cold War in the next video, including new military alliances and the proliferation of nuclear weapons and proxy wars and all the rest. But here I just want to focus on how the Cold War intersected with another major development during this period, namely decolonization. So remember that each power wanted their own ideology to cover the whole Earth. And so as the process of decolonization was creating dozens of brand new states across the world, the US and the Soviet Union raced to influence each of these new states and win them to their respective sides, like two team captains on the playground picking teams for kickball. And so all of these nations are finally becoming free of colonial rule and establishing their own paths to independence, and the United States and the Soviet Union started seeing them as pawns in their larger ideological struggle. And so this growing pressure for newly independent nations to join one side or the other of this superpower conflict that had nothing to do with them was kind of a bummer. However, some groups and individuals in these newly forming states refused to be pawns in this global conflict, which in many ways would make them dependent on more powerful nations, which is exactly the situation that they had just escaped in their recent colonial past. And therefore, something called the non-aligned movement was born. It was led by Indonesian President Ahmed Sukarno, who hosted the first meeting of this movement in 1955. And there, 29 African and Asian heads of state met, among the most significant being India, Ghana, Indonesia, and Egypt. And they all represented new states that were formerly colonies or those still resisting colonial rule in search of independence. And they described themselves as non-aligned in order to communicate that they refused to be controlled by the conflict between these two superpowers. Therefore, the non-aligned movement represented an alternative to the existing economic, political, and social orders created by the Cold War rivalry. However, leaders of non-aligned nations were also shrewd, and they knew how to take advantage of the Cold War rivalry. By feigning support for one side or the other, some non-aligned states were able to gain weapons and resources that they needed for their own defense and development. For example, Indonesia had no problem receiving aid from the Soviet Union in its struggle to create a post-war state, but they also had no problem positively destroying the Communist Party there, racking up something like 500,000 deaths in the process. Okay, all right, y'all, let's keep talking about the Cold War, and here we're going to consider new military alliances, nuclear proliferation, and proxy wars. And it's going to be a saucy one, so if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. So first, let's consider the military alliances that formed as a result of the Cold War. I mentioned in the last video that after World War II, the Soviet Union occupied much of Eastern Europe, which became known as the Soviet bloc, or the Communist bloc. In doing this, they installed communist governments in those countries and made their economies serve the Soviet Union and not their own population. Because of this, the countries of Western Europe, not to mention the United States, got a little twitchy at the thought of having all those dang communists in their backyard. So these Western nations decided to form a mutual defense alliance called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. And essentially, this was an alliance of nations against the Soviets that included the United States at the helm and all these nations right here. But not to be outdone, the Soviets formed a military alliance of their own in 1955 called the Warsaw Pact, which included the Soviet Union at the helm and all these nations right here. And the agreement in both of these alliances was that if any one member state was attacked, that constituted an attack on all of them, and therefore all member nations would respond. Anyway, the creation of these massive military alliances cranked up the tension of the Cold War to 11. Okay, now the second effect of the Cold War was the buildup or proliferation of nuclear weapons. Now, I already mentioned the arms race between the US and the Soviet Union in the last video. Recall that the United States pioneered the use of atomic bombs in World War II, and then the Soviets went ahead and developed their own atomic bombs in 1949. So the United States responded with the development of a hydrogen bomb, which was way more powerful. And so the Soviets were like,
guys, this has gone far enough. Like, no more one-upmanship in nuclear weaponry. On opposite day.
No, the Soviets responded with their own hydrogen bomb, and after a couple of decades, each superpower possessed enough nuclear weapons to blow the world up 1,000 times over. But the crisis moment of this nuclear proliferation came in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So after a failed attempt by the US to oust communist leader Fidel Castro in Cuba, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev shipped a metric buttload of nuclear missiles to Cuba, which was basically in America's backyard. And look at it, there's Cuba, there's the United States. From here, you could blow all this up. And so in 1962, US spy planes discovered these missile sites, and understandably, the US was outraged. But hold on, back up that outrage train just a little bit. I mean, it's not as though the American hands were clean in this respect. They had basically done the same thing by placing nuclear missiles in Turkey, which shared a border with the Soviet Union. But anyway, after the discovery of these missiles in Cuba, President John F. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade around Cuba so that no other weapons could arrive. Now, just to be clear, when you're Fidel Castro and the Americans surround your whole island with warships, this is not a neutral action. It's nigh unto a declaration of war. And so for 13 intense and anxiety-filled days, everyone in America and all over the world had only one thought: is today the day we are going to get blown up. Well, I'm happy to report that the missiles were never fired and eventually all the parties backed down. But what this event did show the world is that the buildup of nuclear weapons was a real problem. Therefore, in 1968, we saw the creation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which called on nuclear powers to prevent non-nuclear countries from developing such disastrous weapons. And finally, the third effect of the Cold War you need to know is the enumeration of proxy wars. Now, because the Cold War was, cold, and that means by definition there was no direct fighting between the two powers. But there was all sorts of indirect fighting, and the name for that is a proxy war. So these proxy wars were small local wars in Africa and Asia and Latin America that took on global scope as the United States and the Soviets took sides and supported the fighting. Now, there are lots of these that we consider, but we're only going to look at three. So first, the Korean War. So after World War II ended, the Allies divided Korea into North Korea and South Korea. The North was occupied by the Soviets, and the South was occupied by the US and its allies. Well, in 1950, after both occupying forces had withdrawn, the communist North Korea invaded the anti-communist South Korea in order to create a single state under its own leadership. And because this was a struggle of communists and anti-communists, the Soviets and the Americans got involved quick, fast, and in a hurry. Now, the United Nations came to the aid of South Korea, and I say United Nations, but it was mostly the United States. And the Soviets didn't send any troops to aid North Korea, but they did send a metric buttload of guns and boom boom. And in this way, the United States and the Soviet Union fought each other without actually fighting each other. Anyway, by 1953, the conflict ended in a stalemate, and everything in the two countries remained largely as they were before the war, except that 3 million people were dead as a result. Okay, the second proxy war to consider is the Angolan Civil War, which began in 1975. So Angola was a colony of Portugal, and as is the custom of colonial powers when it comes time to draw colonial borders, they drew them around rival people groups and threw them under one government. Now, these Angolan ethnic groups, despite their rivalry, united and fought against the Portuguese and won their independence. But once they were actually free, the real question became, which one of these groups would actually hold power in a newly independent Angola? Now, again, this seems like a tidy, nice little conflict in sub-Saharan Africa. They'll figure it out for themselves. There's no need for anyone else to get involved. Ah, crap, here comes the Cold War. So the Soviets backed one of these groups, the United States another, and South Africa yet another. And thus began the Angolan Civil War, and it became another ground for larger powers conducting the Cold War. And finally, the third proxy war to consider is the Contra War in Nicaragua. In 1979, the Sandinista National Liberation Front, who were self-proclaimed socialists, seized power in Nicaragua. And at that, the United States was all like, ain't no socialist gonna be in my hemisphere. So 2 years later, the US backed a group of Contras who tried to overthrow the Sandinistas, who in turn had support from the Soviet Union. And in this attempted overthrow, the Contras committed many human rights violations, and in the end, the conflict ended in a ceasefire, and the Sandinistas were handily defeated in the next election. Alright, we've been bandying about the Cold War for the last few videos, but now it's time to consider the other massive development in this time period, namely decolonization. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. So in terms of decolonization throughout the world, there were two basic means by which nations gained their freedom from their imperial parents, and the first was through negotiated independence, and I've got two examples for you. First, let's visit our friends in India, which, as you may remember, was Britain's most prosperous and valuable colony. As such, they invested a great deal of money to build up India's infrastructure, including railroads and seaports and urban development. Now, all of that investment yielded enormous returns, but all of it was built for the sake of enriching the British Empire and not India. However, that modernization produced the same results in India that it did in other places, namely producing a growing and educated middle class who became increasingly influenced by nationalism and the desire for greater degrees of self-rule. To that end, Indians formed the Indian National Congress in 1885, whose goal was to petition the British government for more of a voice in Indian policy, but those petitions, not surprisingly, were largely ignored by the British. So with that level of snubbing, it may surprise you then that Indians fought by the millions for the British cause in World War I. I mean, they didn't really have a choice about it, but regardless, Indians fought because they believed that such sacrifices would earn them a greater degree of self-rule, but their hopes were again essentially ignored. And so the discontent that followed nearly erupted into violent resistance, especially after British troops slaughtered hundreds of peaceful Indian protesters in the Amritsar massacre. But thanks to the powerful leadership of Indian nationalist Mohandas Gandhi, the imperial resistance movement took on the character of non-violent resistance. And so by the 1920s, in response to that increasing pressure, the British government did transfer some limited authority to the Indians themselves. However, when World War II began, the British again called up millions of Indian troops to fight for their cause, to which the Indians responded, seriously? But they did fight, and once the war was over, Indians demanded their independence, and this time it was a different story. As it turns out, the British were broke enough from the war and had amassed enough pro-independence politicians in parliament that they officially recognized India's independence in 1947. Anyway, India's independent, and that's great. And I wish I could tell you that India's independence marked the beginning of an era suffused with peace and puppies and rainbows. But no. You see, even though the official process of India's independence was negotiated and peaceful, the establishment of India as a new state was fraught with incredible violence, and here's why. So reach all the way back into the brain folds that you developed for Units 1 and 2, and you'll remember that for centuries, India was home to a substantial Muslim minority. And so the Muslims, fearing that they would be marginalized in an independent India, formed a religious and ethnic movement called the Muslim League and called for a new state of their own in the independence negotiation. The result was the partition of India that created the new state of Pakistan and would be the home of India's Muslim minority. But once the two states were created, Hindus fled south while Muslims fled north, and each side committed unspeakable violence against the other. And once the dust had settled, hundreds of thousands, or some estimates say over 1 million people died as a result. And then the second and shorter example of negotiated independence occurred in Africa, namely the Gold Coast. Now, this was also a colony of Great Britain, and in 1947, an independence movement was led by Kwame Nkrumah. And so as he began negotiations with Britain, the situation was similar to India. No longer was there much public support for imperialism, and Britain was in no position to spend money on quelling rebellions while they were busy rebuilding from the war. Therefore, as a result of the negotiations, the new state of Ghana was born in 1957. Okay, now the second major category for how decolonization occurred was through the process of armed struggle. Now, I can multiply examples of negotiated independence and armed conflict all day, but for the sake of simplicity, let me just tell you what was often the deciding factor that determined whether the process of colonial independence was peaceful or violent. And in many cases, it came down to the size of a colony's white European population. You see, for those colonies in which a large population of European settlers had made their homes, they resisted decolonization, and that resistance caused outbreaks of violence in the name of independence. And let me just give you two examples. First, let's consider the independence movement in the French colony of Algeria. Now, here's the interesting thing. Here in Africa, the French held colonial possessions here in Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. For Morocco and Tunisia, France recognized their independence through negotiation and without bloodshed. But France would do no such thing with Algeria. And why? White people? You're dang straight, white people. So remember from the previous period that Algeria had been a hotspot of French migration for a long time, and therefore French citizens living there resisted Algerian independence fiercely. And so in 1954, Arab and Berber Muslims responded by forming the National Liberation Front and staged a series of violent attacks against French troops and civilians in the name of independence. And the French went ahead and responded with a brutality that made the struggle for independence among the bloodiest in the period. French soldiers targeted targeted civilians without restraint and committed human rights abuses on a massive scale. And the war continued until 1962 when President Charles de Gaulle opened negotiations with the Algerians and declared the end of the war and Algeria's independence. Okay, the second example of decolonization through armed struggle was also in Africa, namely Angola. So Angola was a Portuguese colony, and by the 1950s, 3 Angolan political groups had joined together to oppose their colonial rule. And violence broke out during a spontaneous insurrection protesting inhumane treatment of farmers by the Portuguese. And as a result, both sides unleashed violence against one another and neither made much progress. However, in 1974, a bloodless coup occurred in Portugal and the Angolans took the opportunity to open negotiations for independence, which came in 1975. And that's great, but like India and so many other decolonized nations, violence immediately followed. Yes, those 3 rival Angolan ethnic groups had united in order to oust the stinking Portuguese, but once they had done it, those groups immediately fell into a civil war to determine which of them would hold power. And since the 3 groups represented communist and anti-communist, the Angolan conflict became yet another proxy war in the larger context of the Cold War. Now, the most basic explanation for why so many colonial independence movements quickly descended into civil war after winning their freedom is because of the problem of colonial boundaries. Recall from the previous period that imperial powers drew their boundaries around their territorial holdings without respect for the various ethnic and religious groups living within them, which was a problem in many places, but none more pronounced than in Africa. In some cases, those boundaries brought rival groups together, and in other cases, those boundaries split ethnic and religious groups apart. And so that carelessness on the part of imperial powers often led to violent power struggles after colonial independence. And though there are countless examples, let me just mention how that phenomenon played out in Nigeria. So in 1960, Nigerians negotiated their independence from Britain. But a civil war broke out by 1967 over who would gain control over the newly independent Nigeria. It began when the Igbo people, who were a westernized Christian people in the south, tried to secede and form their own nation called Biafra. Now, because their land was rich in oil, the northern government was like, "Ah, heck nah," and resisted that secession violently. And ultimately, the North won out in 1970 and established at last a united Nigeria. But the legacy of colonial boundaries in Africa and in various places throughout the world continue to cause tension to this very day. Alright, so from the perspective of the United States, the spread of communism during the Cold War was about as welcome as a warm fart in an elevator. But spread it did, and that's exactly what we're talking about in this video. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. So the adoption of communism in China was kind of a big deal. Now, I briefly mentioned in the last unit how China's 2,000-year dynastic rule ended with the revolution of 1911 under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen, which established China as a republic. However, by the 1920s, internal tension was brewing against the Nationalist Party because of their perceived dependence on filthy Western powers and institutions. And their main antagonists were the newly formed Chinese Communist Party under the leadership of Mao Zedong. So starting in 1927, there was a bitter conflict between the Chinese Communists and the Chinese Nationalists over who would control China. But in 1931, Japan went ahead and invaded northern China, and so by 1935, the Communists and the Nationalists put their conflict aside for a minute and united to deal with the Japanese. Now, if you're paying attention to dates, you'll recognize that we're on the eve of World War II during all of this. And so once the Japanese were defeated by the Allied powers, the 2 rival Chinese factions went ahead and started up that civil war right where they had left off. And long story short, the Communists won with significant help from the Soviets and had themselves a communist revolution in China. And Chairman Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square in 1949 and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. And under Mao's leadership, China nationalized its industry and redistributed land to peasants by means of a massive collectivization of agriculture. Now, you may recall that Stalin did this very same thing in Russia, and as a result of all the rebellion that occurred because of it, many millions of people died because of famine. However, unlike the Soviet Union, this collectivization in China was a relatively peaceful and bloodless process because of the trust that the Communist Party had built up with peasants during the Civil War period. Oh, and by the way, anyway, Mao brought the Chinese economy squarely under state control through a program called the Great Leap Forward, which was an economic plan to rapidly industrialize China through the development of heavy industry. You see, it was during this period that relations between China and the Soviet Union became seriously strained because Mao believed that the Soviet version of communism had become corrupted, and here is where the Chinese flavor of communism begins to seriously contrast with the Soviet flavor. So in contrast to Stalin's 5-year plans, which aimed to industrialize the Soviet Union by focusing mainly on urban areas, Mao focused on small-scale industrialization in rural areas. However, the industrial goods created in rural areas were on the whole poor quality. Add to that, bad harvest led to the starvation of somewhere between 20 and 50 million Chinese people, far worse than the Soviet famines that were caused by communist control there. But to be clear, it was the turd Chairman Mao who largely caused this deadly event. Because he was concerned to show the world that his brand of communism was working just fine, he refused foreign aid during the famine and continued to export the very grain that could have saved millions of people's lives. Okay, so that's how communism is working out in China. So now let's turn our attention to how communism and socialism was spreading to other parts of the world by means of land reform and the redistribution of resources. And just for poops and giggles, let's begin in Africa, or more to the point, Egypt. So the British and the French completed work on the Suez Canal in 1869 and took pains to control that highly strategic link between Europe and Asia. And I cannot emphasize just how important this little canal was to the economic well-being of European power. Like, instead of having to export and import goods all the way around the entire stinking continent of Africa, they could just take this massive shortcut which saved them all kinds of money. So for them, no Suez, no success. Sorry. And that sets the stage for a massive conflict in Egypt. So in 1952, Gamal Abdel Nasser led a movement to overthrow the British and went ahead and proclaimed independence for Egypt. Okay, we're in the era of decolonization, so that makes sense. Egypt, you go ahead and have your independence. But then Nasser did something that got those Western powers madder than a wet hen. Now, he wasn't a communist, but he did implement socialist reforms for Egypt's land resources, most notably the nationalization of the Suez Canal, which meant that the canal would now be under the control of Egypt alone. Oh, Gamal! You done did it now. Needless to say, this development seriously threatened European interest, and so British, French, and Israeli forces invaded Egypt in retaliation. The Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev threatened a nuclear strike against the invaders. And at that point, US President Dwight Eisenhower put pressure on Britain and France to withdraw, and they did. Okay, second, let's see how communism is spreading in Asia, and for that, we're going to visit our friends in Vietnam. Now, during World War II, Japan occupied Vietnam, which was at that point a French colony. But after Japan was defeated, Vietnam declared its independence both from Japan and France. And in the wake of that declaration, 2 rival governments were established in Vietnam, a communist government in the north and an anti-communist government in the south. And if that smells to you like a proxy war brewing, well then baby, you are spot on. But we're not going to focus on the proxy war here, but rather how communism took shape in Vietnam. So the communist government of the North quickly began a program of land redistribution. A few wealthy landowners held nearly all of Vietnam's agricultural land, but under this program, their ownership was canceled and land was given to the rural peasantry. And finally, let's consider the spread of communism into the Western Hemisphere, namely Latin America. And for that, let's sit a spell with Cuba. So in 1956, Fidel Castro led a revolution in Cuba that eventually established it as a communist state. And chief among his goals was to purge Cuba of dependence on and subservience to the United States, who had been controlling Cuba economically for decades. Therefore, with support from the Soviet Union, Castro immediately launched a program of land distribution and raised wages, which resulted in the transfer of about 15% of Cuba's wealth from the rich to the poor. Additionally, Castro nationalized much of the land that belonged to various U.S. corporations who had exploited Cuba's economy for their own benefit, which was a situation not unlike Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. And so, with their interest under attack, the U.S. CIA led a failed attempt to overthrow Castro, which only further radicalized him in his communist beliefs and led him to develop even closer ties with the Soviet Union. Okay, let's talk about what happened in all these new states that the process of decolonization created in the second half of the 20th century, and I admit it is both spicy and saucy. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, now over the course of the 20th century, decolonization led to the creation of something like 80 new states. And if you'll recall from previous units, imperial powers were keen on drawing colonial boundaries in ways that benefited themselves and not the colonial people. And so in a lot of cases, when states threw off big daddy imperial powers, they inherited those colonial boundaries. Now some states sought to draw new boundaries, but whether they kept the colonial boundaries or drew new ones, the outcome in many cases was nasty, and I'll give you two examples. Okay, so first let's consider the partition of India in 1947. So reach back into your brain folds and recall that the decolonization of India was an example of negotiated independence as opposed to independence through armed conflict. So that's nice, like nobody had to die in the cause of India's independence. But here's where I tell you that after independence, a whole lot of people died on account of all those stupid imperial boundaries and policies. So during the negotiations for India's independence, both the British and Gandhi made frequent and impassioned appeals for India to remain united as a home to both the Hindu majority and the Muslim minority. However, the Muslim League, which represented that Muslim minority, was pretty skeptical that the Hindu majority would treat them fairly in an independent India, and so the Muslims pushed for a state of their own. Long story short, the independence agreement amounted to the partition of India into two states, one for the Hindu people and another for Muslims, known as Pakistan. Okay, so that sounds nice and tidy, like everybody gets what they want, right? Well, on paper, yeah, it makes a lot of sense, but in reality, this solution turned violent real quick. You see, even though the partition and the new boundaries it created largely reflected the existing locations of these rival ethnic groups, still there were significant numbers of Hindus living in the Muslim areas and Muslims living in the Hindu areas. And so when independence came, Muslims fled to the north while Indians fled to the south, and in the process, they committed enormous amounts of violence against one another. And once the dust had settled, over 12 million people had migrated to one state or the other, and over 500,000 had died. Yet another turd-filled legacy of imperialism. And look, I wish I could tell you that that was the last of the conflicts caused by the drawing of those boundaries, but then I would be lying. See, after the migrations were done and the violence had settled, yet another conflict arose over the region of Kashmir. So in every state of the newly independent India, Muslims were the minority, except in Kashmir, where they held a large majority. And the fact that it bordered Pakistan made Pakistanis assume that Kashmir would be added to their territory. However, complicating the issue even further was the fact that the ruler of the state was a Hindu, and that region was home to valuable natural resources. And if you've been paying attention throughout this whole course, then when I say valuable natural resources, then I assume you know where this is headed. India went ahead and declared that Kashmir belonged to them, and Pakistan responded by launching attacks in the region to claim it as their own. The United Nations stepped in to mediate the dispute and insisted that the people of Kashmir themselves vote on the territorial outcome of their state, which, given their Muslim population, would have certainly resulted in Pakistan annexing Kashmir. However, the vote never occurred, and the region has been a source of conflict between the two states and China to this day. China? Where'd China come from? Well, that's a whole other story, so don't worry about it. All you need to remember here is that Kashmir equals conflict. Thanks, imperialism. Okay, now the second example of colonial boundaries causing conflict is the creation of the state of Israel in 1948. Now, before World War I, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire and therefore was home to a Muslim majority. However, as you may remember, the Ottomans took a stiff L in the war, and as a result, Palestine was transferred to Great Britain under the Mandate system, and that put Britain in a tight spot. But why, says you? Well, I'm about to tell you, says I. You see, since the late 19th century, a nationalistic ideology called Zionism gained a lot of traction among Jews scattered around Europe. And one of the chief desires of Zionist Jews was to have a state of their own, specifically in their ancestral land of Israel, which happened to be the same state that we've been talking about, namely Palestine. Now, under the influence of Zionism, large migrations of Jews to Palestine occurred before and after World War I. And in addition to Zionism, this migration was encouraged by the Balfour Declaration, which was a pledge by the British to make Palestine a home for the Jews. Now, I probably don't have to tell you that the Arab Muslims who lived in Palestine vigorously resisted this migration and this re-envisioning of their territory as a home for the Jews. But then things got even more tense on account of a huge spike in Jewish migration to Palestine during World War II as Jews fled the persecution of the Holocaust. Now, after the war, the British could discern no tidy way to solve the Palestine problem, so they handed the decision to the United Nations, who declared that Palestine would be partitioned into two states, one for the Jews and one for Arab Muslims. And Jews, not surprisingly, accepted this plan and declared independence in 1948. But the Palestinians found this about as welcome as a porcupine in a balloon factory and refused to give up their land to what seemed to them yet another consequence of European colonial control. Therefore, almost immediately, Palestinians took up arms against the Israelis with support from neighboring Arab states. And in the end, the Israelis won that war, but several other conflicts between the two groups would erupt throughout the 20th century. And even today, the legacy of this partition has the region embroiled in conflict. Okay, now let's completely shift gears and consider how these newly independent states fared economically. But we're not going to consider every detail here. In fact, you really only need to focus on one idea in this section. That's how governments got involved in directing their economies after independence. And I'm feeling saucy, so I'm going to give you two examples. First, let's revisit our boy Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, whom we talked about in the last video. But here you just need to understand that as a key member of the non-aligned movement, Nasser played off the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union in order to get all kinds of involved in helping Egypt's economic development. For example, in 1956, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which brought it squarely under Egyptian control. And when Western powers invaded, Nasser gained Soviet support to end the conflict. And then in 1970, he oversaw the completion of the Aswan High Dam on the Nile River, which provided electricity and irrigation for much of Egypt. Additionally, Nasser initiated social welfare reforms, including free schooling and healthcare for Egyptian citizens. Now, Nasser's economic policies had some ups and some downs, but the point is the Egyptian and government played a significant role in directing their economy after independence. And then the second example of this trend comes from India under the leadership of Indira Gandhi, no relation to this guy, who became the first and so far only female prime minister of India in 1966. And as it turned out, she inherited an economic crisis brought on by the ongoing conflict with Pakistan and the droughts that had caused widespread famine. And in response, she implemented a series of 5-year socialist economic plans which aimed to allow the government to assert more control over the economy instead of relying on foreign aid from powerful Western nations. So one of her main legacies here was her adoption of the Green Revolution, which used science to develop high-yielding grain, and we'll talk more about that in Unit 9. And this development increased harvest yield and made India agriculturally self-sufficient. Additionally, Gandhi oversaw the nationalization of key Indian industries and introduced significant government regulations on others. Her nationalization of banks and the increases of taxes on the wealthy, along with her 20-point economic plan, reduced inflation and increased production throughout India. And finally, the last development we need to consider is how colonial independence often led to significant waves of migration. Now, the language you're going to see on your exam is that these people migrated to metropoles, which in the age of imperialism designated the territory of the imperial country in distinction from their colonial holdings. So, for example, India was a colony of Great Britain, so Great Britain would be the metropole of India. So during this period, lots of Indians in this example migrated to Great Britain. And if you've been paying attention for the last couple of videos, that sounds a little weird, right? I mean, why would former colonial subjects migrate to the land of their former imperial overlords? Well, over the long history of colonialism, imperial states and their colonies developed both cultural and economic connections with one another. So even if the presence of an imperial power was unwelcome in a colony, the colonial people grew familiar with the customs and culture of that occupying power. Therefore, in light of the various economic difficulties faced in newly independent states during decolonization, some people chose to migrate to the cities of those metropoles to find work. So we see many South Asians migrating to Great Britain, Algerians to France, and Filipinos to the United States, for example. And ultimately, this mass migration transformed these majority white and culturally homogenous societies into genuine multi-ethnic societies. Not to mention, those migrations kept the cultural and economic ties between those two places alive and well. Okay, I probably don't need to tell you by this point that the 20th century was chock full of conflict and violence. But what we do need to consider in this video are the various responses to conflict that existed after 1900, and, well, that's what we're about to do. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, so the first kind of response to conflict you need to know is nonviolent resistance, and there are 3 main figures you need to know in this category. But remember, you don't merely need to know their names and what they did. You also need to understand how their resistance movements affected political change in their respective environments. Oh, and if you want note guys to follow along with this video and all my videos, then check the link in the description. Okay, so first let me introduce you to Mohandas Gandhi, who promoted nonviolence and civil disobedience in the cause of independence for India. Now, he began his political life as a member of the Indian National Congress, and he became its leader by 1921. And during the 1930s, he fully embodied nonviolent resistance against British imperial policies and the Indian cause of independence through several significant acts. First, Gandhi and his followers participated in the homespun movement. In protest of Britain's economic dominance of India's cotton industry, Gandhi encouraged his followers to boycott British-made textiles and make their own clothes at home. And he himself did this by refusing to wear the Western-style suits that he had worn in his earlier years as a lawyer and instead wore the traditional dhoti of Indian culture. The second significant act of civil disobedience that Gandhi led his people into was the Salt March, and this was a reaction against the British salt monopoly. So the British colonial government had made it illegal for Indians to harvest their own salt, which they had in abundance along their seashore. And so in order to protest this injustice, Gandhi led his followers on a march to the sea where they bent down and harvested their own salt. And although an imperial police squad was waiting for them at the coast, and although they had already broken up the salt deposits and buried them in the mud, Gandhi dug them up and processed his own salt. And his followers began to do so as well. And for this defiance, Gandhi was arrested, one of multiple occasions in which he spent time in jail for his civil disobedience. And over time, though the British certainly retaliated against the movement, Gandhi's efforts began to break Britain's colonial hold on India. And after World War II, Britain no longer had the resources or overwhelming public support to continue to resist Indian independence. And thus, Gandhi and his actions were a key player in one of the most momentous political changes in Indian history, namely its independence from British colonial rule. Okay, the second figure who led a nonviolent resistance movement was Martin Luther King Jr. He was a black Baptist minister in the United States and took significant inspiration from Gandhi's methods in his own fight against America's racial segregation laws. And so as the leader of the growing civil rights movement, which aimed to secure equal rights for black Americans, King and his followers also resisted unjust laws by means of civil disobedience. In Alabama, for example, which was deeply segregated according to race, King staged the Montgomery bus boycott, in which black Americans boycotted the city's public transportation system. And the boycott caused the city significant economic distress in Montgomery and then in other places as the movement spread elsewhere. And like Gandhi, King was also arrested on several occasions for his acts of civil disobedience. But ultimately, the civil rights movement affected political change as the United States Supreme Court outlawed racial discrimination in schools in the 1950s and Congress passed anti-discrimination laws in the 1960s. And then the third figure who resisted by means of nonviolence was our boy Nelson Mandela in South Africa. But here's where I tell you that Mandela doesn't fit as neatly in this category as Gandhi and King, because although he began promoting nonviolence, later he changed his tactics and, just let me explain. So once South Africa had secured its independence from Great Britain, the minority white population rose to power and introduced legalized racial segregation under a group of policies known as apartheid. Therefore, Nelson Mandela, a prominent member of the African National Congress, led black South Africans in acts of nonviolent resistance that included boycotts and strikes. And so that's how it began, but a series of events caused Mandela to champion violence as the only way to achieve equality in South Africa. You see, while Mandela was standing trial for treason, a nonviolent protest was occurring in the town of Sharpeville. And in order to suppress it, the police began firing into the crowd, killing 69 people and injuring many more. And so the treason trial, combined with outrage over the Sharpeville massacre, led Mandela and other anti-apartheid activists to abandon nonviolent approaches and adopt violence in their struggle for freedom. And although he was jailed for more than 2 decades for his connection to those violent acts, upon his release in 1994, he ran for president and won office, which was the final nail in the coffin of South African apartheid. Okay, now I don't think it's too much to say that nonviolent responses to conflict were kind of the outliers. Far more frequent were violent responses to conflict, and by committing to force, some individuals and groups actually intensified violence and suffering, and I'll give you 3 examples. First was Augusto Pinochet in Chile. So Pinochet led a military coup to overthrow the democratically elected president Salvador Allende, who happened to be a Marxist and had been implementing socialist policies. And don't forget, we're in the context of the Cold War here, so any Marxist rulers are going to get the United States real twitchy. Therefore, with significant help from the United States, Pinochet assumed power and ruled over Chile as a dictator, and with that power, he violently suppressed opposition to his leadership. The military conducted raids and executions and torture against Pinochet's political enemies, including members of leftist political parties and labor unions in the Catholic Church. Okay, a second example is Idi Amin in Uganda, who, after assuming power through a military coup in 1971, responded to ethnic conflict in Uganda with exceptional violence. He demonized the large South Asian population of Uganda, who had made significant contributions to the economy for centuries, claiming that they were responsible for taking jobs from Ugandans. And in the midst of his chaotic chaotic rule, Amin became known to the Western world as the Butcher of Uganda because of the frequent campaigns of violence that he carried out against his own people and his rivals. In some cases, the violence targeted ethnic groups, and in others it targeted political enemies, and in still others it targeted seemingly random groups and individuals whom Amin deemed his enemies. And in the end, the manner in which Amin responded to conflict intensified violence in Uganda. And though a clear number of deaths has been difficult to assess, the estimates are somewhere between 80,000 up to 500,000. Okay, a third example is kind of different, but definitely relates, namely the rise of the military-industrial complex. So as fear and economic pressure caused some states to worry about the future, one response to this anxiety was to defend the future by building up their military. And the poster children for this kind of response was the United States and the Soviet Union, as they raced to stockpile enough nuclear weapons to destroy everything that exists. And this buildup was a self-feeding cycle. As military spending increased, so did the number of people who relied on this industry for their jobs. So that meant that if a policymaker did want to cut military spending, then they'd also be putting huge amounts of people out of work. Thus, this military-industrial complex served to increase violence throughout the world because it was economically profitable to produce and sell weapons. And finally, we need to consider how some groups used violence against civilians in order to achieve political goals, and the word for that is terrorism. And here I'll just mention one of these groups, namely Al-Qaeda, founded and led by Saudi Arabian billionaire Osama bin Laden. So Al-Qaeda was a militant Islamic group that had deep grievances concerning the involvement of the United States in Middle Eastern states, most notably Iran, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. And they responded with acts of terrorism against civilians in various parts of the world in order to pressure the United States to change their policies in the region. The most infamous of these terrorist acts was the September 11th attacks on the United States, which left more than 2,000 Americans dead. But that didn't really dissuade the United States from getting involved in the Middle East. In fact, it only intensified their involvement, but we'll save that for Unit 9. Okay, welcome to 1991, and I reckon we ought to check back in with the Cold War and see how it's going. And here comes the collapse of the entire stinking Soviet Union, and that's gonna end the Cold War quick, fast, and in a hurry, so let's talk about it. If you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, now there are about 1,000 causes for the end of the Cold War, but in this video we're gonna talk about 3 of the main causes, and the first is the technological and military advancements of the United States. So by the early 1980s, the US and the Soviet Union had produced over 12,000 nuclear missiles, and all those weapons of mass destruction were pointed at one another. And a major consideration that kept their respective fingers off the launch buttons was the guarantee that if either did start a nuclear war, it would certainly end in mutual assured destruction. Even so, it was tense between the two powers for a long time. However, that tension did relax somewhat during a period of détente in the 1970s. For example, US President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, better known as SALT I, in which both states agreed to prohibit further manufacture of nuclear weapons. But then in 1980, the US elected Ronald Reagan as president, and he took a much harder line against the Soviets and decided to take that détente and flush it down the toilet. To that end, Reagan spearheaded the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. It was a system that rendered any attack on the US by nuclear weapons obsolete. And how would that be? Well, the SDI sought to launch defense systems into space that could detect a nuclear launch and shoot them down from space with lasers. Like they were going to shoot down nuclear missiles from space with lasers. And therefore, it was no wonder that the detractors of this plan dubbed it Star Wars. And look, even though the SDI never really came to pass, it represented a growing divide between the US and the Soviet Union. Reagan believed that the Soviets would attempt to match the US spending in weapons development, and in large part, he was right. But the problem was that since the 1970s, the Soviet economy had been stagnant and could not support that kind of spending. Therefore, the Soviet attempts to keep up with the US military and technological investment led them into further economic decline. Oh, okay, now the second cause of the Soviet collapse and the end of the Cold War was the failed Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So in 1979, Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan in order to prop up its communist regime against Afghan Muslim groups that had sought to overthrow it. However, the Afghan rebels were supported and supplied by the United States and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. And so while the Soviets were able to control some of Afghanistan's major cities, they could not win the rural guerrilla war waged against them by the rebels. And so all in all, the Soviet Union waged this losing battle for 9 years, and that effort further depressed the Soviet economy. And the third cause and final nail in the coffin for the Soviet Union was the policies of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who rose to power in 1985. Now, in addition to what I just mentioned about a second ago about Soviet economics, in the later 1960s and early 1970s, the Soviet economy was in a crisis. Like, foreign trade was extremely limited, and then government control of agriculture stifled that industry because farmers didn't have enough freedom to decide what to plant and how much to sell their crops for. Additionally, Eastern European Soviet bloc countries were growing more and more discontent with Soviet oppression. For example, the Prague Spring, which was a series of mass protests in Czechoslovakia, erupted in 1968 as a reaction against oppressive Soviet policy. And the Soviets violently crushed this outcry, but the sentiment was spreading, and the Soviet state was having to devote more and more resources that they did not have to putting those rebellions down. With all this background, the liberal reformer Mikhail Gorbachev enters stage right with some policies in his pocket that's ultimately going to lead to the demise of the Soviet Union. The first policy was known as perestroika, which was a restructuring of the economy to address all their economic woes by reducing the level of central planning from the government. His second policy was known as glasnost, which means openness. And under this policy, all the dissent and the criticism against the government and its policies that had so long been brutally silenced by previous leaders was now allowed. And as it turns out, there was a lot of it. And then third, Gorbachev decided that the Soviet Union would no longer use military intervention in order to prop up communist governments in its own sphere of influence. And with those developments, satellite states in the Soviet bloc took quick advantage of the loosening Soviet grip. So democratic reform movements erupted in one Eastern European country after another, and that led to similar reform movements in the Soviet Union proper as people in Lithuania and Georgia and other states began declaring independence and breaking free from Soviet control. And then in 1989, the Berlin Wall was torn down and Germany was reunited. And in response to all these destabilizing forces, the Soviet legislature voted in 1991 to dissolve the Soviet Union, thus marking an end to the Cold War. Okay, all about globalization. In this video, we're going to talk about the positively dizzying amount of new technologies developed in the 20th and 21st centuries that increasingly connected the world into a big old social, political, and economic hugfest. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. And first, let me tell you what we mean when we talk about globalization. Now, by definition, globalization is the phenomenon by which trade and technology have created a politically, economically, and socially interconnected world. And look, although we've witnessed trends in globalization throughout the course of the trade routes in Unit 2 and the Age of Imperialism and the World Wars, in the last 2 centuries, globalization has progressed at a much faster pace thanks to various technologies. And each of these new technologies transformed our world in some way, whether it was increasing lifespans or making energy more accessible or further connecting the world into a globalized economy. And you're going to need to know some of these technologies, so let me explain it up real nice for you. But first, let's talk about new communication technologies after 1900. And just to be clear, you don't just need to know what these technologies are, but you're also going to need to be able to describe how they change the world in their application. And also, you need to remember that all these technologies were not evenly distributed throughout the world. Not surprisingly, wealthy industrialized countries had them first, and then they spread somewhat unevenly to other places. Anyway, for communication technologies, the main effect of these sweet bippies was to solve the problem of geographical distance. Like, if we're going to get a globalized world that is positively surging with interconnectedness, then we've got to find a way to make stronger connections across great distances. And so, remember, like in the early part of this course, maritime technologies like new shipbuilding techniques and navigational tools overcame this distance. And then later, it was railroads and telegraphs. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, new communication technology shrank the geographical distance between places even more. For example, the rise of radio as a mass form of communication facilitated this process. This little box in people's homes allowed individuals and families to actually hear the voices of people who were delivering information to them, as opposed to, say, a newspaper, which was only in print. Also, it eliminated the intermediary filter between the speaker and the listener. Like prior to this, if a leader gave a press conference, for example, his or her message was translated through a news reporter who might emphasize their own pet biases. But on the radio, the speaker spoke exactly as he or she wished, directly to the listener. For example, American President Franklin Roosevelt utilized this medium and broadcast his voice into American homes during the Great Depression and World War II. He used the medium to comfort Americans during hard economic times and update them on all the New Deal policies that he was enacting to support them. And then by the 1960s, the television had replaced the radio as the dominant form of mass communication and entertainment for much of the developed world. And with news broadcasts of the war in Vietnam or the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, people were able to feel connected to geographical places that were across the world. And then third, we had the rise of cellular technology. So the telephone was invented in 1876 in the United States, and though it was too expensive for most people, the societal elites took advantage of the ability to talk to other people across great distances. And that technology basically remained unchanged until the 1980s, when cellular technology was introduced, which enabled connectivity through the air. And with the rapid development of cell phones, people can talk to other people across the world no matter their location. And look at that, shrinking geographical distance, baby! That is what we're talking about. And then fourth, and arguably most impactful of all, was the rise of the internet. The first iteration of the internet was developed in the United States in the 1960s as a way to share both military and scientific data. But by the 1990s, the technology had been developed to the point where it was more affordable to the average citizen. And therefore, with the concurrent rise of personal computers, the 1990s gave us the World Wide Web. And you know, as someone who was alive for this development, I have to say, if you have never had to wait 4 minutes to connect to the internet while those sweet and sultry tones played, then you're missing out. Anyway, by the turn of the millennium, the internet was responsible for connecting the world's population through email and connecting businesses with their customers in a pattern that accelerated the phenomenon of global communication and commerce. Okay, also helping to solve the problem of geographical distance in a globalized world was new transportation technology. And the widespread use of automobiles was kind of a big deal here, which had the effect of fundamentally changing urban landscapes by creating suburbs. And then second, whereas railroads were the chief transportation technology that eliminated geographical distance a century ago, air travel took its place in the middle of the 20th century, especially in Western countries. So due to the massive economic growth Western nations experienced after World War II, more people could afford to fly for both work and for pleasure, all of which had the effect of shrinking geographical distance between various places. And third, arguably no transportation innovation affected global economics more than the widespread use of shipping containers. And you're like, what? I never even heard of shipping containers. Well, they're massively important, so let me tell you about them. So shipping containers are standardized metal boxes that can be stacked uniformly for shipping non-bulk cargo like food or clothing, or in some cases raw materials. And today, almost all consumer goods are transported across the world in these things. And this development created the conditions for major businesses to relocate their manufacturing sectors to developing countries. And why would they do that? Because in peripheral countries, labor costs are lower, and thus businesses save money by manufacturing their goods in places where wages are cheap and goods can be easily shipped in containers. Okay, moving right along to new energy technologies, and there are two that you need to know here. First is the widespread use of petroleum and all its byproducts. So not only is petroleum refined into fuel for cars and planes, but it has also been used to generate electricity, which has largely been democratized, at least throughout the developed world. And since petroleum turned out to be a more efficient power source than coal, that darling of the Industrial Revolution, it has replaced coal as the main power source of industrial manufacturing. And that has had the effect of increasing production in order to meet the demand for consumer goods across the world. But also pollution and pending global disaster, but yeah, we'll save that for another video. And second, the 20th century saw the rise of nuclear power. As it turns out, scientists were able to harness all that power originally designed to blow up massive amounts of people and channel it towards creating energy for civilian use. And because nuclear energy emits very little pollution from its chemical reactions, it was championed as the cleaner alternative to fossil fuels like petroleum. But disasters at nuclear plants in the United States and in the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s created enormous amounts of human and environmental damage, which led to the cooling of public opinion on this energy. And now let's consider new medical technology after 1900. Okay, now there were a couple significant medical advances that helped people live longer lives. The first was antibiotics, which was a substance that killed bacterial infection. In 1928, the first antibiotic was developed, and it was called penicillin. It saved the lives of many people, not least of which was soldiers fighting in wars, and gave them a means by which they could survive infections that previously would have killed them. And then second, we see the widespread use of vaccines. Now, vaccines, of course, were not new to the 20th century, but there certainly was a spike in their application. You see, early forms of this practice were around in 17th century China, but in the 20th century, medical advances produced an astonishing number of vaccines against some of the world's most persistent diseases like measles and pneumonia and polio and influenza. Now, another medical technology developed didn't extend people's lives, but it certainly did change them, and it was medical birth control. So in the 1950s, a birth control pill was developed which consisted of a synthetic hormone which prevented pregnancy. And the result of the widespread use of this pill caused fertility rates across the world to decline, which is to say that women were having fewer babies on average. For example, in Japan and several European countries, they're experiencing a population decline, and other countries like the United States are seeing a significant slowdown in their population growth. However, in the developing world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, their populations are growing quick, fast, and in a hurry. And finally, let's consider how new agricultural technologies led to an increase in the global food supply, which is kind of a big deal because there are an awful lot of mouth holes to feed around here. First was the dramatic increase in commercial farming. So as opposed to subsistence farming, in which farmers grow small-scale crops mainly for their own consumption, the main goal of commercial farming is to sell agricultural products on the market and maximize profits. And so this kind of mass production of food requires expensive technologies like motorized tractors and combines, and therefore commercial farming mainly occurs in wealthier countries. And then second, the Green Revolution fundamentally changed agriculture in the 20th century. So basically in the 1950s and 60s, scientists applied the science of genetic modification to food and developed new strains of high-yielding grain crops. And these new strains were introduced to developing countries like Mexico and India and Indonesia, which had huge populations to feed, but not high enough crop yields to feed everyone. And in those places, it worked marvelously. Like grain crops yielded 3 to 4 times their normal output and enough food was produced to feed their population. But it wasn't all puppies and rainbows, since the Green Revolution technologies also created concerns about environmental harm. For example, farmers were encouraged to double crop or plant more than one crop in the same soil per year, which is a big reason that more food could be produced. But that kind of intensive use of the soil led to exhaustion and erosion. And then critics also noticed that with the increased use of chemicals for these new crops, agricultural runoff could lead to significant pollution of freshwater sources. Okay, technology and globalization. It's great and all, but here's where I tell you that those realities have their, limitations. And so in this video, we're going to talk about one of the main scourges of the globalized world, namely disease. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked COVID-19 style, well, let's get to it. Okay, it shouldn't be a surprise to you by this point that the world's wealth is not exactly evenly distributed. There are rich countries and there are poor countries and everything in between. And I'm not just flapping my mouth hole about economic inequality for funsies. When it comes to diseases in the modern era, there's a very clear geographical distribution of certain diseases that corresponds to levels of wealth and development. Therefore, although medical technology was developed to assess and cure many common diseases in the last century, access to that technology has not been equal. So that means populations of wealthy nations with well-developed healthcare systems have far greater access to the various medical interventions that address disease, and less developed nations, well, they don't. Therefore, it tends to be among impoverished populations that diseases for which cures are available still persist, and I'm feeling saucy, so I'm going to give you 2 examples. Now, the first disease associated with poverty is malaria, which is a disease spread by infected mosquitoes, and it typically occurs in large numbers throughout warmer tropical regions. You know, malaria, in case you never had it, is not fun. People infected with malaria experience flu-like symptoms, but in some cases, complications often result in death. And though effective medical interventions for malaria have been developed, not to mention more practical measures like mosquito nets, there are still hundreds of thousands of deaths per year in impoverished regions of the world, most notably sub-Saharan Africa. And then second is tuberculosis, which is an airborne disease that severely affects the lungs and can be fatal. And look, a cure was developed at the end of the 19th century, but again, access to this intervention is disproportionately favoring wealthy countries, which is why TB remains a disease associated with poverty. And the second big category of disease after 1900 we need to consider is epidemics and pandemics. And I'll give you a couple of examples, but you also need to remember 2 very important things about them. First, the spread of diseases caused no small amount of social disruption, which is a fancy way of saying that people were dying all over the dang place, and that caused an awful lot of problems. And second, the crisis caused by these diseases often led to new technological and medical advances. Okay, so the first big spread of disease that you need to know is the 1918 influenza pandemic. Now, you may have heard this called the Spanish flu, which is all kinds of a misnomer for all kinds of reasons that I can't get into right now. But just for clarity, Spanish flu, 1918 influenza pandemic, same thing. Anyway, this was the deadliest pandemic of the 20th century, and it happened to occur right after World War I was drawing to a close. So, you know, thankfully it showed up just in time to put the cherry on top of the giant mass death sundae that was the Great War. So just like earlier pandemics, it spread rapidly and globally along travel and trade routes because of all the increasing global interconnection. Ultimately, the pandemic claimed something like 50 million lives over the course of 2 years and had a massive impact on demographics across the world, especially since it disproportionately affected people of working age. And unfortunately, this flu virus just mowed people down by the millions because medical scientists were unable to develop any significant interventions to stop the spread of the virus. And then the second epidemic you need to know is the spread of HIV/AIDS, which starting in the 1980s led to the deaths of millions of people worldwide. Man, I'm just starting to realize this is a pretty depressing video, but we'll carry on. So in case you don't know, HIV is the virus that causes AIDS, which severely depresses the immune system, making a person vulnerable to other diseases which they could otherwise fight off. And because this disease was associated early with gay men and drug addicts, funding for research into this cure was, to put it mildly, difficult to come by. However, by the 1990s, those prejudices were largely discarded and new medical interventions were developed to treat the disease, and that has led to this once deadly disease becoming more of a chronic illness. And that's nice, but again, because the drugs are expensive, AIDS remains a deadly disease among impoverished communities, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And then third, the pandemic you've all been waiting for, the pandemic that many of you actually lived through, COVID-19. So despite the medical advances of the 20th and 21st centuries, this new pandemic emerged in 2020 and was transmitted through the air. And because of our deeply interconnected planet, the disease spread globally and real fast. And as you may recall, COVID-19 affected societies by requiring the closure of schools and businesses, as well as affecting global economics. Even so, a vaccine for the disease was developed rapidly to combat the virus and distributed globally, to which I say, noise. And finally, the last category of disease we need to briefly consider is the growing prevalence of diseases associated with old age. You see, now that medical technology has afforded many people in more developed countries maybe an extra decade or 2 to live, there are some diseases that are simply associated with living longer lives. First is Alzheimer's disease, which is a form of dementia that disproportionately affects the aging population. Those who are affected with it suffer memory loss, and as the disease progresses, it undermines basic bodily functions and can eventually lead to death. And then second is heart disease. So as it turns out, an extra decade to live means 10 more years to stuff Big Macs into my mouth hole. And as it further turns out, that is not great for my heart. And there are also genetic factors as well. But the point is, as people live longer, especially in developed nations, heart disease has become a massive problem affecting the health of millions. Okay, it might be understating the case, but globalization has had significant consequences on the environment. And in this video, I'm going to tell you all about it. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked greenhouse gas style, well, let's get to it. Okay, let's begin by considering the environmental effects of globalization on land. But let me back up a second and make something clear. So when we talk about the environment in this course, we're not merely talking about nature, like rivers and trees and pigs. When we talk about the environment, we're talking about the physical world, yes, but also included is the way humans interact with that physical world. And so unless you've been sleeping through the last couple of units, you'll remember that the process of industrialization and urbanization has led to massive human impacts on the land. And I'm feeling spicy, so I'm going to give you 2 examples. Now, the first effect is deforestation, which refers to the large-scale clearing of trees in a geographical area. And that's not hard to understand, right? Like here's a forest, and then globalization comes in to de-it. But why, says you, does globalization have that effect? Well, says I, there are a lot of reasons, but there are basically 2 major ones. First, urbanization, which refers to the increasing size and populations of cities, has created the problem of urban urban sprawl, which refers to the increasing size of the urban footprint. Again, not hard to understand. As a city gets bigger in geographical scale, well, it's gonna need some more land on which to settle its growing urban hind parts. And because cars have made it easier for middle-class folks to live outside the city in suburbs, then that necessarily leads to the clearing of forests in order to build their nice little suburban homes with their nice little white picket fences. But then second, forests are cleared to create more farmland, especially for large commercial farming outfits that keep the world's growing number of mouth holes fed. And although there are positive economic and demographic aspects to these developments, their environmental impact has been significant. Like the world's forests, especially the rainforest, provide a home to an astonishing number of animal species that have become endangered and gone extinct through deforestation. Like, look at this lemur, whom I have named Raymond. And Raymond is just so cute, I love him so much. But don't get too attached, because Raymond and all his kind are now extinct because of deforestation. Moment of silence for Raymond. We love you, buddy. Anyway, deforestation also creates the conditions for increased levels of pollution, since land without trees is susceptible to erosion, and as a result, the pesticides used in large-scale farming run off into rivers and streams, which contaminate fresh water supplies. Okay, now in addition to deforestation, another environmental effect of globalization has been desertification, which refers to the transformation of once fertile land into infertile land. And this primarily occurs when land converted to farmland is not well suited for agriculture, or it's not well managed. And the result is the ground being emptied of nutrients and becoming desert-like, which, in case you've never tried to plant crops in a desert, I will tell you is useless for cultivation. And so with the intense demands on agricultural land imposed by large-scale commercial farming, this is becoming an increasing problem. But you didn't think globalization only caused environmental problems on the land, did you? Don't be crazy. No, we've got air and water problems too. So first, globalization has led to a significant decline in air quality in many places, and that's a problem because air is kind of important to, staying alive. But anyway, the global spread of industry, which has largely been dependent on fossil fuels for energy, has contributed significantly to air pollution, most notably in major cities, and let me give you my favorite example. So in 1952 in London, an event known as the Great Smog occurred. Basically, industrial coal emissions combined with fog to create a poisonous smog that covered the city for 5 days, killing somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 people and making about 100,000 very ill. Or another example, in Mexico City, government officials estimated in 2002 that the city's polluted air caused the death of about 35,000 people per year. So yeah, urban air has gotten nasty. But then second, globalization has led to increased competition over the world's fresh water supply. You might be thinking, last time I checked, there was a metric buttload of water on planet Earth, so what's the problem? Well, the problem is that only about 3% of that water is usable by human beings, and the Earth's rapidly increasing population has created a rising demand for that 3%. Like, because there are more mouth holes to feed, the majority of freshwater consumption goes towards industrial scale crops. Additionally, many developing nations have the added problem of finding access to clean water for their populations. The World Health Organization estimates about half the world's population today lacks clean drinking water. And finally, one of the most significant global environmental consequences that has occurred in the last century is climate change, which refers to the warming of the planet due to the release of greenhouse gases. And you don't necessarily need to know all the scientific details of this phenomenon for this course, but what you do need to know is that the phenomenon of climate change has gotten people riled up into a fierce debate. Now, to be clear, the fact that the planet is warming up is beyond debate, but the debate centers around the causes of that warming, since the potential solutions to the problem require political action. When things get political, they get nasty. And essentially, the debate comes down to this. One side argues that climate change is caused by humans, and the other side argues that it is a natural cycle of the Earth, not caused by humans. And the bitterness of that debate is caused by several interlinking factors. First, if climate change is caused by humans and the widespread growth of industrialization and all the economic benefits that come with industrialization, then addressing the problem requires societies to slow their capacity for industrial growth, which in turn decreases their ability to grow economically. And to put it mildly, that is not an attractive solution, especially to wealthy developed nations. But then second, the debate has been especially intense among highly developed nations in the rest of the world. You see, those nations became the most developed and the wealthiest precisely because they made prodigious use of industrial technologies. But in doing so, they contributed to the potential global disaster of climate change. Therefore, knowing this, if the global community decides to restrict the amount of greenhouse gases that can be emitted into the atmosphere, then developing nations who are attempting to improve their own economic standing will not have access to the very tools that create economic well-being in an industrialized world, and that's kind of a bummer. Okay, let's just keep right on going with globalization and talk about how it has affected economics after 1900, baby. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked free market style, then let's get to it. And just for poops and giggles, let's begin by observing the trend of the spread of free market economics in our globalized world. Now recall that the conditions of globalization have created an increasingly interconnected global economy that in some ways is new and in other ways continues trends that we've considered in previous units, and let me explain. Now reach way back into those brain folds that you developed in Unit 7 and remember that during the World Wars and the Great Depression, a common trend in many places was that Big Daddy government took more of an active role in directing economic decisions of states. However, by the 1980s, this trend was rejected in several significant states in favor of the free market policies of neoliberalism. And that just refers to an economic emphasis on free market policies that include the lowering of trade barriers like tariffs and the deregulation of industry and the transfer of public sector industries to private parties. In other words, neoliberalism is all about the government getting its filthy hands off the economy. Now, you're going to need to know some examples of this trend, and lucky for you, I got some. So first, you've got the liberalization of the U.S. economy under the leadership of Ronald Reagan. Now, Reagan was elected as a staunch antagonist of New Deal policies and government spending on public services. And so to that end, he led the government to decrease taxes on the wealthy, reduce government regulations of businesses, and cut spending on social welfare programs. However, I should mention that since Reagan was in power during the Cold War, his squeamishness about government spending did not apply to military spending because under his presidency, that number spiked tremendously. And then second, you've got a similar trend in the United Kingdom under the leadership of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. And just like Reagan, Thatcher emphasized the deregulation of businesses, a reduction in income taxes, and the privatization of state-owned assets. And the legacy of both Reagan and Thatcher on the economy is kind of mixed depending on which variables we consider. Yes, both leaders' policies did help reduce inflation and create the conditions for the economic growth of both countries. But their policies also also worked, for example, to undermine the power of labor unions so that more power was in the hands of business leaders. Additionally, under both leaders, the gap between the wealthy and the poor increased significantly. Before, a third example of this trend is Chile under the leadership of Augusto Pinochet. Now, despite being a grade A authoritarian turd, Pinochet did lead the Chilean economy away from state control and into the area of the free market. And most responsible for this change was a group of economists known as the Chicago Boys, who graduated from the University of Chicago and set out to solve the economic problems in Chile. Now, the Chicago Boys were able to address Chile's rampant inflation and privatize state-run businesses. Now, the truth is, the reforms were fairly unpopular because Pinochet enforced them with brutality like the nasty authoritarian that he was. But even so, with this free market groundwork laid, later Chilean leaders were able to guide Chile into a fairly balanced economy. Okay, now another major development of globalization, especially after the Cold War, is the unique geographical distribution of exactly where economic activity occurs in the world. So for several centuries before this period, the most powerful nations in the world were those that had industrialized, and you know this by now. And especially early on, one of the main features of that industrialization is that the factories and all the laborers that made those factories work were located within that country itself. So Great Britain was a political and economic world power because they had the factories within the boundaries of Great Britain. But beginning in the 1970s, the cost of domestic manufacturing began to increase significantly, and corporate investment in factory infrastructure no longer seemed to be a good investment. And so this development led to a new global distribution of work, and here's what I mean. So wealthier developed countries became more characterized by knowledge workers whose main capital for work was not their bodies, but rather their minds. Essentially, workers in a knowledge economy aren't people who make things, they're people who think about things. For example, engineers and teachers and lawyers and bald, bearded, gap-toothed men who make AP World History videos on YouTube. This kind of work has quickly become a major player in the globalized world. For example, let's talk about the knowledge economy in Finland. In the 1990s, Finland invested heavily in communication technology and education, and a big part of what that investment yielded was a healthy share of the world's cell phone and software development market. And this was a massive shift for Finland. Since as late as the 1950s, it was mainly an agrarian society. Okay, a second example is Japan, who also invested heavily in education in order to transition into a knowledge economy. However, there was some drag because Japan's economic policies in many ways resembled the old mercantilist economies, which emphasized exports above imports. They did this by subsidizing manufacturing in order to keep costs low and enacting steep tariffs to stifle imported goods. But workers were the ones who paid for this progress since their wages were kept low enough that they couldn't even afford to buy the things that they were manufacturing. And as a result, labor unions began gathering strength and were able to agitate for themselves an agreement for higher wages. The point of all of this is that during the 20th century, Japan became a churning engine of manufacturing, but they eventually diversified their economy, and in the later part of the 20th century became a world leader in the knowledge economy by focusing on banking and finance and the development of information technology. So in the new globalized economic landscape, wealthier developed countries are doing most of the thinky work, but manufacturing, on the other hand, was now increasingly being located in developing countries where international businesses could save money by paying lower workers to foreign workers than was legal in their own country. And so the highest concentration of the world's manufacturing sector is now located in Asia, in places like Vietnam and Bangladesh, and in Latin America, in places like Mexico and Honduras. And all of that has been made possible because of the communication and transportation technologies that we talked about in the video for 9.1. Okay, now let's talk about the fact that global economics requires global economic institutions to make everything run. And important note here, the rise of these institutions were both caused by globalization and have further fostered globalization by their policies. Now, there are plenty that you can know here, but I'm just going to give you one of these organizations, namely the World Trade Organization, which exists to regulate trade on a global scale. And essentially, the WTO promotes global trade by assisting in the negotiation of trade deals, acting as a moderator for various trade disputes, and creating initiatives to assist developing countries along the scale of development. So to my previous point, the WTO was caused by globalization and increasing economic interconnectedness, but by creating the conditions for increased global trade, it has also fostered further globalization. But in addition to global economic institutions, the globalized economy has also created the conditions for the proliferation of smaller regional trade agreements, and I'm in the mood to give you two examples. First is the European Union, which today represents a complicated conglomerate of many European nations into a political and economic bloc. However, it began as a simple economic agreement in the post-World War II era between 6 European countries, and they agreed to integrate their coal and steel operations by removing barriers to trade between them. Anyway, that arrangement evolved over time and included more and more countries until 1993 when the European Union was officially formed. And today, 27 countries are members, and without getting too far into the weeds, that means that those 27 countries have essentially merged into a kind of singular economic unit, which is far more economically powerful than any one of those countries could be on their own. And then across the world, you have another regional economic agreement known as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And like the EU, this agreement facilitates trade among Southeast Asian countries by keeping trade barriers like tariffs low. And as a result, the member nations together have experienced significant economic growth beyond that of non-member nations like Japan or India. Okay, now let's talk finally about the rise of multinational corporations in this globalized economy. Now, by definition, a multinational corporation is an entity which is incorporated in one country but manufactures and sells goods in other countries. And the architecture of these corporations is as follows. They employ knowledge workers in their own countries, and then they manufacture goods for sale in other countries, and then they sell those goods on a global market. Now, maybe that sounds familiar because we've witnessed this kind of organization already during the age of imperialism with joint stock companies like the Dutch East India Company. But after 1900, the complexity and geographical distribution of these companies became far more complex. Now, one example of a multinational corporation is Nestle. Now, this company is headquartered in Switzerland, and then they purchase and manufacture their chocolate with low-wage work in West Africa, and in some cases child and enslaved labor, and then they sell that tasty treat on the world market. And then another example of this kind of company is Mahindra & Mahindra, which is an Indian company that makes automobiles and farm equipment and many other things. And while they're based in Mumbai, they have operations in North America and Australia, Europe, Africa, and Latin America. Okay, the agenda for globalization is the big honking movement for human rights and liberation that it has created, and I don't know about you, but I'm in the mood to talk about it. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, so as you'll no doubt recall by now, globalization has brought many different cultures into more abundant contact with one another, and that has led to a series of movements for reform on a variety of issues, but all of them shared a common theme, namely liberation. Now, the first major manifestation of this new rights-based dialogue was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights created by the United Nations in 1948. And this declaration articulated the basic human rights that belong to all human beings just by virtue of the fact that they were human beings. And more particularly, the declaration sought to protect the rights of all those citizens of the global community who had long been trampled under oppressive structures, people like women and children and refugees. For example, in order to uphold the rights of children, the UN established UNICEF, or the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, which devoted its resources to feeding children who were still hungry in the aftermath of World War II. And second, with respect to women's rights, the 20th century produced some massive changes for them as well. In 1975, we saw the United Nations First World Conference on Women, in which representatives from all over the world met to plan steps for the advancement of women over the next decade. 4 years later, in 1979, another conference was held which bore the very descriptive but unwieldy title, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, at which they proposed an international Bill of Rights for women. Now, this Bill of Rights included provisions for women's suffrage, the right to marry a spouse of their choosing, equality in education, and the right to birth control and other family planning measures. So, globalization has also led to the rise of a movement for black liberation. A good example here is the Negritude movement, which was a rights-based movement for black equality that emerged in the 1930s and 1940s among French-speaking Caribbean and African artists. Now, it was primarily a literary and ideological movement that elevated blackness and black culture as worthy of celebration and dignity over against the racial legacy of colonialism and racism. And not only did this movement have the effect of promoting awareness of black culture as a positive force, but it also provided the language and discourse for future anti-colonial and civil rights movements across the Caribbean and Africa and other marginalized communities. And fourth, globalization created the conditions for the rise of rights-based religious movements like we saw with the spread of liberation theology. Now, liberation theology was a movement that was born in Latin America as a re-envisioning of the Christian theology of the Catholic Church. And in a break with the power-based imperial character of Catholicism, liberation theology emphasized Christ's concern for the poor and the marginalized and called for the transformation of oppressive power structures. And as it turns out, liberation theology has had a significant effect on the Catholic Church, which has reformed itself to work for social justice and emphasize solidarity with the poor. And then, moving right along, the era of globalization has also created the conditions for discourse on access to education and politics. And what I mean is, as the global human rights discourse progressed throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, reforms were implemented in terms of education and politics to be more inclusive of gender and race and class and religion. For example, the 20th century became the context for the rapid expansion of women's suffrage throughout the world. As a result of feminist movements, many governments legally recognized women's right to vote and to hold political office. For example, in the United States, women's right to vote was legally recognized in 1920, and then in Turkey in 1934, and Japan in 1945, only to name a few. A second example comes from the marginalized black communities of the United States, who gained a victory with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was passed as a result of the relentless pressure of the civil rights movement. Anyway, this law prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in public accommodations, in publicly owned facilities, in employment, and in federally funded education programs. So, liberation achieved. I mean, kind of like, we'll talk about it when you get to A push. And then a third example comes to us from India with the introduction of the caste reservation system. Now, remember that traditionally, members of the lowest castes in India were treated with shame and socially marginalized. But with the implementation of the caste reservation system, a certain percentage of seats in educational institutions and government jobs and elected positions were reserved for members of historically marginalized caste groups. And finally, let's consider calls for environmental and economic reform that globalization created. I mean, to put it mildly, not everyone is a big fan of the effects of globalization, so let's hear some of their complaints. First, let's talk about protests against the environmental effects of globalization with the rise of environmentalism. Now, environmentalism as a movement had begun in the 19th century, but it was largely restricted to individual states and regions. So, for example, romantic poets in Europe denounced the degradation of the landscape as industrial factories and their filthy pollution multiplied in their regions. Or in the United States, a conservation movement began under President Teddy Roosevelt that aimed to protect America's forests from the incessant march of industrial progress. But it wasn't until the 20th century that protests against the environmental effects of globalization became a truly global movement because those effects were not felt equally across the world. And so, in response to these pressures, Greenpeace was founded in 1971, which is known for its use of nonviolent protest tactics, which they use to raise awareness and advocate for environmental protection. And they use all kinds of tactics like protests and blockades and direct interventions to confront environmental threats. And then on the other side, an effort at economic reform in a globalized world was the rise of the World Fair Trade Organization. Now, recall that a major economic effect of globalization was the large-scale movement of the manufacturing sector to developing nations where multinational corporations could save money by paying foreign laborers lower wages. Shady as heck, but, that's how it works. Anyway, the World Fair Trade Organization represents one movement that sought to reform such exploitative practices like low wages and long hours and unsafe working conditions and lack of job security. And so, fair trade principles advocated by the WFTO aim to ensure that producers receive fair prices for their goods, enabling them to earn a sustainable livelihood and invest in their community. Okay, what happens when globalization takes all the world's cultures and smashes them together into a giant global hug? Well, you get a globalized culture, and baby, that's what this video is all about. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked K-pop style, well, let's get to it. So throughout this course, we've checked in with all kinds of different cultures, and we've seen how those cultures have interacted with one another in various ways. But in this period, new communication technologies like the internet and new transportation technologies like air travel meant that people from various cultures around the world were interacting at a far greater pace than ever before. And the result has been the rise of a recognizable global culture, which, to be fair, has had strong tones of Western culture dominating. And look, it's not as though local cultures have been erased by this global culture, but local cultures have certainly been deeply influenced by it. So that's the context, and now let me give you some examples. First, the arts have been influenced by globalization, and here I'm going to talk about how local and regional styles of music have become global phenomena. For example, reggae music originated in Jamaica, but thanks to the popularity of Bob Marley, this regional form of music has become known and loved throughout the world. Like literally, I love Bob Marley, you love Bob Marley, somebody's grandma in India loves Bob Marley, he's everywhere. And then another example is the rise of K-pop, which began as a distinct musical style in South Korea in the early 2000s, but a decade later, viral videos of K-pop groups like BTS spread across the world through social media, and now K-pop is a global phenomenon. How long do I have to wait, and how many more nights do I have to stay up? Am I right? Second, a global culture of entertainment has risen as a result of globalization. For example, the United States produces a metric buttload of international films in the center of their movie industry, namely Hollywood. Like the top 10 highest grossing films of all time were produced there. And you're like, who cares? You care, my young pupil, because these films are released globally and draw millions of viewers across hundreds of different cultures, and therefore they have contributed to the creation of a global culture. Do you remember when I said earlier that the global culture has strong tones of Western values? Yeah, one big reason for that is the global export of American entertainment. Like, come on, who doesn't love it when Captain America is finally found worthy to wield Mjolnir? And the answer is apparently everyone in the world, because Avengers Endgame is one of the highest grossing films of all time. But wait a minute, who is that guy again? Oh, Captain America. Like the hero is Captain America. If you're American, you're probably not getting my point, so let me put it this way. Like, can you imagine Americans lining up by the millions to see a movie whose hero is named Captain China or Captain Russia? I mean, if I know Americans, it's probably not gonna happen. So that's why some critics see the prevalence of Hollywood films throughout the world as a kind of cultural imperialism. These films are heavily freighted with American and Western values, and since their reach is so broad, some people worry that local cultures which hold opposing values are threatened by such globalized entertainment. Oh, and by the way, hasten to add that globalized entertainment hasn't only been influenced by the United States. In fact, another example in the entertainment industry is Bollywood, which is a massive film industry based in Mumbai, India. And Bollywood produces far more films than Hollywood, and they're known for their fantastic musical numbers, their colorful visuals, and the melodramatic storytelling. And even though Bollywood films primarily cater to Indian audiences, the films have gained popularity worldwide, particularly in South Asia, the Middle East, and diaspora communities. And then the third manifestation of globalized culture is the rise of global sports. So spectator sports became a truly global phenomenon in the 20th century due to televised international events like the Olympics and the World Cup. And both events, while certainly international in nature, are also platforms for the promotion of nationalism as athletes from various countries compete for the ultimate prize. But the global nature of these events are definitely apparent when you consider just how much of the Earth's population tunes in to watch them. Like during the last Summer Olympics, more than 3 billion people around the world watched the games, and the last World Cup gathered something like 1.5 billion viewers globally, a viewership that will make even Mr. Beast poop his pants. Okay, now let's turn the corner and consider how globalization has led to the rise of a global consumer culture. And by definition, that describes a lifestyle devoted to spending money on mass-produced material goods. And though they're not entirely responsible for this, the United States has played a big role. So after the end of World War II, the United States shifted its tremendous industrial capacity, which had produced enormous amounts of munitions for the war, squarely towards the production of consumer goods. And these mass-produced goods included clothing and household appliances and just about anything else you can think of, like appliances that can print your face on toast. You know what I've been missing at breakfast? Eating my own face. Anyway, with the rise of the advertising industry, companies were able to transform America into a consumer culture whose economy largely rose and fell on the number of mass-produced goods that the population was willing to buy. And because the United States, as I mentioned earlier, had an oversized influence on the global culture and economy after World War II, consumer culture became a global phenomenon. The result was that many countries throughout the world either became consumers of these brands or producers of their own global brands. And you know a lot of these global brands, like you've got McDonald's or KFC. And hey, do you want your mind blown? Of all the places in the world, where do you think you're going to find the highest number and concentration of KFC restaurants? America? I know that's what you want to say, but no, it is China. What? Yeah, for whatever reason, China loves them some world-famous Kentucky Fried Chicken. Or consider Coca-Cola. It's a brand that originated in the United States, but in the second half of the 20th century, the brand expanded to a dizzying number of places throughout the world. But again, it's not just American companies who represent global brands. I reckon you've heard of a little car company called Toyota, which is a Japan-based multinational corporation which sells cars in 170 countries throughout the world. And then finally, a massive contributor to the development of our consumer culture is the rise of online retailers which help facilitate the global flow of goods. For example, Alibaba is an online Chinese retailer that sells consumer goods to people all across the world, and eBay is an American online retailer that facilitates online auctions for about 135 million users throughout the world, only half of which live in the United States. Okay, so we've been having all kinds of fun in this unit talking about the effects of globalization in the last 100+ years. But all those effects haven't been puppies and rainbows throughout the world, and so in this video we're going to consider various resistance movements protesting globalization. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked Bretton Woods style, then let's get to it. Now, if you've been with me since the beginning of this unit, you'll know that the globalizing of the world's economy and culture has fundamentally changed the world since 1900. That is beyond debate, but the real question is this: has this change been for the better or for the worse? Well, let's look at these changes from the positive side. Economic globalization was responsible for the largest bout of economic growth in the history of the world. Like, for example, while the global population quadrupled in the 20th century, the world's economy output multiplied by 40. And that means on the whole, that fantastic economic increase has led to better standards of living, better healthcare that extended lifespans, widespread education and literacy, etc. And then on the cultural side of things, because of this increased interconnection between the world's cultures, global movements for human rights have been implemented on a massive scale. So that's great, right? Like, thanks to globalization, the world is as happy and wholesome as Mr. Rogers' sweater vest. Who could find any problem with those outcomes? Well, as it turns out, that is not the whole story. And I know you want the whole story, so let's consider the negative effects of globalization, both in terms of economics and culture. But before to understand resistance movements against economic globalization, I have to first tell you about the creation and policies of a couple significant international economic institutions. The story begins in 1944, just 1 year before the end of World War II. In that year, the United States led a meeting of capitalist nations known as the Bretton Woods Conference. And because one of the main causes of the Second World War was that series of global economic crises after World War I, this conference aimed to construct a post-war world that would be more stable and contribute to economic flourishing. And so to that end, the conference members created two organizations in order to make that a reality. First was the World Bank, which was created to provide financial assistance for the reconstruction of Europe after World War II. However, later in the century, it shifted its focus to providing loans and technical assistance to developing countries for projects aimed at reducing poverty and promoting economic development and achieving sustainable growth. And then second, they created the International Monetary Fund to facilitate monetary cooperation among all the member states of the world. And so both of these organizations made it their aim to promote free trade and keep global currency values, which would be evaluated by the value of the American dollar, stable and free flowing. And so this global economic order became kind of the standard operating procedure for the post-war world. And while it certainly created the conditions for that profound economic flourishing that I mentioned earlier, that flourishing was not evenly distributed throughout the world. You see, critics argue that the Bretton Woods system carried out by the World Bank, the IMF, and other global institutions like the World Trade Organization marginalized populations in the global south for the economic benefit of the global north. It's kind of like the old system of imperialism in which imperial powers exploited colonial economies for their own benefit. And that dog just can't learn any new tricks. So the global economic policies created by these institutions made it easy for multinational corporations, for example, to exploit laborers in developing countries that lack regulation for their policies. Additionally, critics argue that this global approach to economics challenges and undermines more local economic decisions in the name of a global order. Therefore, in response, a significant anti-globalization movement has arisen in an attempt to change these policies. And probably the most visible manifestation of the resistance to this new global economic order was the Battle for Seattle in 1999. And that year, the World Trade Organization met in Seattle to establish their financial goals for the new millennium. And to their great annoyance, a massive anti-globalization protest formed outside with over 40,000 people from a large diversity of of backgrounds. Now, the police response to the activists was harsh, including the use of tear gas and rubber bullets to try to disperse the crowd. However, what was notable about that protest is that it marked the beginning of a much larger anti-globalization movement that represented the interest of those who have been marginalized by global economic policies. Okay, now global economic policies aren't the only target of resistance, so too is the increasing influence of globalized culture. You see, because the advent of social media outlets like Facebook and Twitter have been a huge catalyst for the spread of culture, some states have resisted the intrusion of globalized culture by developing their own local social media sites, and here I'm going to tell you about China. So China went ahead and shut down sites like Facebook and Twitter because by their reckoning, those outlets were responsible for creating unrest in their country. For example, in 2009, a riot broke out between the majority Han and the minority Uyghur population. Now, the Uyghurs are Muslims and have had a long history of abuse in China. But the point is, the Chinese government blamed social media sites for trafficking in ideas that caused this uprising and therefore shut it down. But the Chinese government knew that people still need their social media because after all, those memes ain't gonna share themselves. Anyway, to replace those filthy Western social media programs, China introduced its own platform called Weibo, which allowed the Chinese people to do the same things they did on Facebook and Twitter, but without the danger of Western ideas sneaking in because the government filtered out any information that they deemed unfit. Okay, you made it. This is the last topic of the entire stinking curriculum. But hey, wipe that tear off your cheek because we still gotta learn about supranational organizations that have developed in a globalized world. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked United Nations style, let's get to it. Okay, now all throughout this unit, we've been talking about how the world has been shrinking due to the globalization of economies and communication and travel and culture. And a major effect of all of this has been the formation of several supranational organizations that have risen to help facilitate global cooperation. And I've already introduced you to a few of them over the course of the last few videos, organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, etc. But for sure, the great granddaddy of all these organizations is the United Nations. So I reckon we ought to sit down and visit with it for a spell. Now, you'll recall that the United Nations was created right after World War II had come to a close. Its purpose was to create an international body where nations could hammer out their problems by talking and negotiating rather than, blowing each other up. And the United Nations was kind of like the League of Nations 2.0. Remember that the League was created for the same purpose after World War I, but it didn't really have any authority to enforce its resolutions on member nations, and so it largely failed its purpose. For example, when the League of Nations told Hitler to stop his expansion of German territory in Central Europe, Hitler was like, and then he just kept on going. Same story over in Japan. Therefore, after World War II, the United Nations was created to shore up the weaknesses of the League of Nations. And this organization aimed to accomplish two purposes: to prevent war and to facilitate cooperation among the world's nations. And to that end, the United Nations formed several different bodies, only two of which I'm going to tell you about here, so let's see how they're doing. The first body of the UN is the General Assembly, which includes representatives from all member nations, which today includes 193 out of 195 states in the world. So only 2 independent states in the whole world are not members of the UN, which is to say they are classified as permanent observers in the General Assembly. First, you've got Vatican City, which is like the official state of the Catholic Church, and the Pope does not want the Vatican tied up in international politics. And according to Catholic doctrine, the Pope is infallible, so can't argue with that. And the other non-member state is Palestine, and though they have applied for membership on multiple occasions, they haven't been accepted into the club, and I'm going to tell you why in just a minute. Anyway, the General Assembly is the body of the UN which is responsible for discussing and making policies for all member nations, many of which have humanitarian purposes. For example, the General Assembly created UNICEF, or if you're not into the whole brevity thing, the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund in 1946 to provide social welfare services to children throughout the world. And since that time, UNICEF has rolled out global initiatives for child immunizations, education, and emergency relief for children and mothers in the aftermath of disasters. Now, in the era of decolonization, many newly independent states joined the UN, and the General Assembly swelled in size quick, fast, and in a hurry. And as a result, for much of the second half of the 20th century, the General Assembly became a significant forum for negotiating and addressing the difficulties decolonized states faced in their era of independence. Now, the second main body of the United Nations is known as the Security Council, and this body is responsible for keeping peace in a globalized world. It's made up of 5 permanent members: the US, China, France, Russia, and the United Kingdom, and then 10 rotating representatives among the various member nations. Now, here's where things get a little saucy. Each of the 5 permanent members have veto power over any policies. Like, they wrote that power right into the charter, and that power has caused some contention. For example, in the midst of the Cold War, the UN was unable to prevent many wars throughout the world because the permanent members had no qualms about using their veto power to protect their own interests at the expense of global interests. Or more recently, the UN put forward a resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine beginning in 2022. But wait just a hot second. I think I remember saying about 30 seconds ago that Russia was one of those permanent members of the Security Council with that sweet, sweet veto power. And so can you guess which of those permanent members went ahead and vetoed that condemnation? It was Russia. Or do you remember earlier when I said that Palestine has been prevented from UN membership? Well, reach back into them brain folds to what you learned in Unit 8 about the creation of the State of Israel. Remember that this Jewish state partitioned out of the heart of Muslim Palestine was heartily supported by Western powers, none more than the United States and the United Kingdom. And then further remember that over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, Israelis and Palestinians have been fighting for control over that territory. And so when Palestine applies for membership, can you think of any permanent members of the Security Council who might veto it? And look, I know that one is a contentious issue, but the only point I'm trying to make here is that the permanent members of the Security Council have often used that power to protect their own interests. Even so, the Security Council is able to work towards keeping peace in a way that the League of Nations could not. It has authority to send military peacekeepers to help stabilize violent situations and to impose economic sanctions on states that are creating the conditions for violence and war or otherwise violating human rights. And in some cases, the UN's peacekeeping efforts have been successful, as they were in negotiating a ceasefire agreement in Liberia in 2003 after years of civil war. However, in other cases, their efforts have failed, as they did in Rwanda in 1994. And despite a large presence of UN peacekeepers, they were slow to respond, and the Rwandan genocide ultimately ended up with the death of an estimated 1 million people. Regardless, the existence of the United Nations is both the result of globalization and continues to foster the growth of globalization all at the same time. And that is it. If you've been with me through all these videos, then let me just say I appreciate you coming along. It's been a long road, but we have finally reached the end. And I wish you all the best on your exam in May, and make sure you stick around the channel because I'll be doing everything I can to get you ready for it. Okay, since that national exam is right around the corner, you can click right here and check out my AP World Heimler Review Guide, which has everything you need to study as fast as possible and get that 5 that you deserve. So it's Heimler signing off for the last time in AP World History. I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.
Today, I will be showing you the exact strategy I use to answer 55 AP World multiple choice questions in just 10 minutes. That averages to around 10 seconds per question. You can still secure an easy 75 to 80% plus, or otherwise a 5 on the AP exam. Now, do I recommend you do this on the AP exam? No, because you do have 55 minutes, but this is a training system and you can copy it and do the exact same thing. It's going to help you with your pacing and make the actual AP exam a breeze. But what exactly is the secret? Well, you are going to just skip the stimulus. If that sounds crazy, don't go anywhere. I'll be explaining everything, how it works, best practices, alongside some killer tips for the multiple choice section in general. And at the end of this video, I'll flash on the screen some AP World multiple choice questions so you can use this strategy in practice. Onto the actual strategy, which boils down to skipping the long quotes and blocks of text, the stimulus, essentially, right? So what you want to do for this training is aim to spend as little time per question as possible. You want to treat it as a race, like a game, a challenge. And at this point, although accuracy is nice in the beginning, your utmost priority is to start recognizing question patterns and cues so that you can instantly recognize them on the actual AP exam. You can find unlimited practice material online using something like Crack AP. It's pretty much just questions from review books like Princeton, Barron's, all of them compiled, and you are going to run this strategy 2 to 3 times before taking a traditional practice exam at 55 minutes. Now, when you do take that full practice exam at 55 minutes, it will feel so relaxed without feeling rushed because you've been trained on recognizing patterns and filtering through the jargon, nonsense, and unimportant details in order to get to the final answer. Now, when you do use this system, there are a few things you have to keep in mind, otherwise it is going to be tough. The first is to always read the small parts like source headings, who it's by, doc dates, etc. Just not the big fat blocks of text and crap, don't read those. Now, next, you also want to make sure you really understand, also utilize the chronological sequences within history and understand the broad cause and effects. Legit, you do not need to memorize any dates or anything like that, but you do need to at least know what generally is going on in each period of history. Also, use common sense. So if a source is from the 1400s England and the question asks what system of governance the author would agree with, don't say something like communism, okay? And another thing is to look for obviously wrong answers and eliminate them straight away. You can usually get rid of 2, and that's another benefit of using the speed training because it's useful when you're not reading the stimulus. You won't get confused with the other answer choices. Now, do not eliminate anything unless you are 99% sure that those are wrong. And my last tip, guys, before we get into the practice is to think objectively. AP World multiple choice questions are much broader comparatively to a class like APUSH. This means you need to have a general grasp of the knowledge, time era, trends, whatever, in order to pick the right answer. But yeah, that does it for all the tips and systems. So now we're going to get into the questions. So here we have a stimulus. It looks like some sort of Aztec temple. That's cool. And then a long block of text by a guy named Hernan Cortez. Hopefully that name rings a bell. It's a letter. We're looking at a time frame of around the early 16th century, and boom. That's all we need to do with the stimulus. Less than 10 seconds to analyze it. And now we're going to answer the questions. They will flash on the screen. Pause the video to answer them, and I'll leave the answers along with my reasoning in the pinned comment below. That's all. Good luck on your exam, and make sure you subscribe if you learned something.